First, it provides physical evidence that the act occurred. Once a man wrote what the Chinese wanted, it was very difficult for him to believe that he had not done so. The opportunities to forget or to deny to himself what he had done were not available, as they are for purely verbal statements. No, there it was in his own handwriting, an irrevocably documented act, driving him to make his beliefs and his self-image consistent with what he had undeniably done. A second advantage of a written testament is that it can be shown to other people. Of course, that means it can be used to persuade those people. It can persuade them to change their own attitudes in the direction of the statement. But more important for the purpose of commitment, it can persuade them that the author genuinely believes what was written. People have a natural tendency to think that a statement reflects the true attitude of the person who made it. What is surprising is that they continue to think so even when they know that the person did not freely choose to make the statement. Some scientific evidence that this is the case comes from a study by psychologists Edward Jones and James Harris, who showed people an essay that was favorable to Fidel Castro and asked them to guess the true feelings of its author. Jones and Harris told some of these people that the author had chosen to write a pro-Castro essay, and they told the other people that the author had been required to write in favor of Castro. The strange thing was that even those people who knew that the author had been assigned to do a pro-Castro essay guessed that he liked Castro. It seems that a statement of belief produces a click-whir response in those who view it. Unless there is strong evidence to the contrary, observers automatically assume that someone who makes such a statement means it. Think of the double-barreled effects on the self-image of a prisoner who wrote a pro-Chinese or anti-American statement. Not only was it a lasting personal reminder of his action, it was also likely to persuade those around him that the statement reflected his actual beliefs. And as we will see in Chapter 4, what those around us think is true of us is enormously important in determining what we ourselves think is true. For example, one study found that after hearing that they were considered charitable people, New Haven, Connecticut housewives gave much more money to a canvasser from the Multiple Sclerosis Association. Apparently, the mere knowledge that someone viewed them as charitable caused these women to make their actions consistent with another's perception of them. Once an active commitment is made, then, self-image is squeezed from both sides by consistency pressures. From the inside, there is a pressure to bring self-image into line with action. From the outside, there is a sneakier pressure, a tendency to adjust this image according to the way others perceive us. And because others see us as believing what we have written, even when we've had little choice in the matter, we will once again experience a pull to bring self-image into line with the written statement. In Korea, several subtle devices were used to get the prisoners to write, without direct coercion, what the Chinese wanted. For example, the Chinese knew that many prisoners were eager to let their families know that they were alive. At the same time, the men knew that their captors were censoring the mails and that only some letters were being allowed out of camp. To ensure that their own letters would be released, some prisoners began including in their messages peace appeals, claims of kind treatment, and statements sympathetic to communism. The hope was that the Chinese would want such letters to surface and would therefore allow their delivery. Of course, the Chinese were happy to cooperate because those letters served their interests marvelously. First, their worldwide propaganda effort benefited greatly from the appearance of pro-communist statements by American servicemen. Second, in the service of prisoner indoctrination, they had, without raising a finger of physical force, gotten many men to go on record as supporting the Chinese cause. A similar technique involved political essay contests that were regularly held in camp. The prizes for winning were invariably small, a few cigarettes or a bit of fruit, but were sufficiently scarce that they generated a lot of interest from the men. Usually the winning essay was one that took a solidly pro-communist stand, but not always. The Chinese were wise enough to realize that most of the prisoners would not enter a contest that they could win only by writing a communist tract. and the Chinese were clever enough to know how to plant small commitments to communism in the men that could be nurtured into later bloom. So the prize was occasionally given to an essay that generally supported the United States, but that bowed once or twice to the Chinese view. The effects of this strategy were exactly what the Chinese wanted. The men continued to participate voluntarily in the contest because they saw that they could win with an essay highly favorable to their own country. But perhaps without realizing it, they began to shade their essays a bit toward communism in order to have a better chance of winning. The Chinese were ready to pounce on any concession to communist dogma and to bring consistency pressures to bear upon it. In the case of a written declaration within a voluntary essay, they had a perfect commitment from which to build toward collaboration and conversion. Other compliance professionals also know about the committing power of written statements. The enormously successful Amway Corporation, for instance, has hit upon a way to spur their sales personnel to greater and greater accomplishments. Members of the staff are asked to set individual sales goals and to commit themselves to those goals by personally recording them on paper. One final tip before you get started: set a goal and write it down. Whatever the goal, the important thing is that you set it, so you've got something for which to aim and that you write it down. There is something magical about writing things down. So set a goal and write it down. When you reach that goal, set another and write that down. You'll be off and running. If the Amway people have found something magical about writing things down, so have other business organizations. Some door-to-door sales companies use the magic of written commitments to battle the cooling-off laws recently passed in many states. The laws are designed to allow customers a few days after purchasing an item to cancel the sale and receive a full refund. At first, this legislation hurt the hard-sell companies deeply. Because they emphasize high-pressure tactics, their customers often buy not because they want the product, but because they are duped or intimidated into the sale. When the new laws went into effect, these customers began canceling in droves. The companies have since learned a beautifully simple trick that cuts the number of such cancellations drastically. They merely have the customer, rather than the salesman, fill out the sales agreement. According to the sales training program of a prominent encyclopedia company, that personal commitment alone has proved to be a very important psychological aid in preventing customers from backing out of their contracts. Like the Amway Corporation, then, these organizations have found that something special happens when people personally put their commitments on paper. They live up to what they have written down. Another common way for businesses to cash in on the magic of written declarations occurs through the use of an innocent-looking promotional device. Before I began to study weapons of social influence, I used to wonder why big companies such as Procter & Gamble and General Foods are always running those 25, 50, or 100 words or less testimonial contests. They all seem to be alike. The contestant is to compose a short personal statement that begins with the words, "Why I like," and goes on to laud the features of whatever cake mix or floor wax happens to be at issue. The company judges the entries and awards some stunningly large prizes to the winners. What has puzzled me was what the companies got out of the deal. Often the contest requires no purchase. Anyone submitting an entry is eligible. Yet the companies appear to be strangely willing to incur the huge costs of contest after contest. I am no longer puzzled. The purpose behind the testimonial contests is the same as the purpose behind the political essay contests of the Chinese communists. In both instances, the aim is to get as many people as possible to go on record as liking the product. In Korea, the product was a brand of Chinese communism. In the United States, it might be a brand of cuticle remover. The type of product doesn't matter. The process is the same. Participants voluntarily write essays for attractive prizes that they have only a small chance to win, but they know that for an essay to have any chance of winning at all, it must include praise for the product. So they find praiseworthy features of the product and describe them in their essays. The result is hundreds of men in Korea, or hundreds of thousands of people in America who testify in writing to the product's appeal and who, consequently, experience that magical pull to believe what they have written. The public eye. One reason that written testaments are effective in bringing about genuine personal change is that they can so easily be made public. The prisoner experience in Korea showed the Chinese to be quite aware of an important psychological principle. Public commitments tend to be lasting commitments. The Chinese constantly arranged to have the pro-communist statements of their captives seen by others. A man who had written a political essay the Chinese liked, for example, might find copies of it posted around camp, or might be asked to read it to a prisoner discussion group, or even to read it on the camp radio broadcast. As far as the Chinese were concerned, the more public, the better. Why? Whenever one takes a stand that is visible to others, there arises a drive to maintain that stand in order to look like a consistent person. Remember that earlier in this chapter, we described how desirable good personal consistency is as a trait, how someone without it could be judged as fickle, uncertain, pliant, scatterbrained, or unstable, how someone with it is viewed as rational, assured, trustworthy, and sound. Given this context, it is hardly surprising that people try to avoid the look of inconsistency. For appearance's sake, then, the more public a stand, the more reluctant we will be to change it. An illustration of how public commitments can lead to doggedly consistent further action is provided in a famous experiment performed by a pair of prominent social psychologists, Morton Deutsch and Harold Gerard. The basic procedure was to have college students first estimate in their own minds the length of lines they were shown. At this point, one sample of the students had to commit themselves publicly to their initial judgments by writing them down, signing their names to them, and turning them in to the experimenter. A second sample of students also committed themselves to their first estimates, but they did so privately by putting them on a magic writing pad and then erasing them by lifting the magic pad's plastic cover before anyone could see what they had written. A third set of students did not commit themselves to their initial estimates at all. They just kept the estimates in mind privately. In these ways, Deutsch and Gerard had cleverly arranged for some students to commit themselves publicly, some privately, and some not at all to their initial decisions. What Deutsch and Gerard wanted to find out was which of the three types of students would be most inclined to stick with their first judgments after receiving information that those judgments were incorrect. So all of the students were given new evidence suggesting that their initial estimates were wrong, and they were then given the chance to change their estimates. The results were quite clear. The students who had never written down their first choices were the least loyal to those choices. When new evidence was presented that questioned the wisdom of decisions that had never left their heads, these students were the most influenced by the new information to change what they had viewed as the correct decision. Compared to these uncommitted students, those who had merely written their decisions for a moment on a magic pad were significantly less willing to change their minds when given the chance. Even though they had committed themselves under the most anonymous of circumstances, the act of writing down their first judgments caused them to resist the influence of contradictory new data and to remain consistent with the preliminary choices. But Deutsch and Gerard found that by far it was the students who had publicly recorded their initial positions who most resolutely refused to shift from those positions later. Public commitment had hardened them into the most stubborn of all. This sort of stubbornness can occur even in situations where accuracy should be more important than consistency. In one study, when 6 or 12-person experimental juries were deciding a close case, hung juries were significantly more frequent if the jurors had to express their opinions with a visible show of hands rather than by secret ballot. Once jurors had stated their initial views publicly, they were reluctant to allow themselves to change publicly either. Should you ever find yourself as the foreperson of a jury under these conditions, then you could reduce the risk of a hung jury by choosing a secret rather than public balloting technique. The Deutsch and Girard finding that we are truest to our decisions if we have bound ourselves to them publicly can be put to good use. Consider the organizations dedicated to helping people rid themselves of bad habits. Many weight reduction clinics, for instance, understand that often a person's private decision to lose weight will be too weak to withstand the blandishments of bakery windows, wafting cooking scents, and late-night Sara Lee commercials. So they see to it that the decision is buttressed by the pillars of public commitment. They require their clients to write down an immediate weight loss goal and show that goal to as many friends, relatives, and neighbors as possible. Clinic operators report that frequently this simple technique works where all else has failed. Of course, there's no need to pay a special clinic in order to engage a visible commitment as an ally. One San Diego woman described to me how she employed a public promise to help herself finally stop smoking. I remember it was after I heard about another scientific study showing that smoking causes cancer. Every time one of those things came out, I used to get determined to quit, but I never could. This time, though, I decided I had to do something. I'm a proud person. It matters to me if other people see me in a bad light. So I thought, maybe I can use that pride to help me dump this damn habit. So I made a list of all the people who I really wanted to respect me. Then I went out and got some blank business cards, and I wrote on the back of each card, "I promise you that I will never smoke another cigarette." Within a week, I had given or sent a signed card to everybody on the list. My dad, my brother back east, my boss, my best girlfriend, my ex-husband, everybody but one, the guy I was dating then. I was just crazy about him, and I really wanted him to value me as a person. Believe me, I thought twice about giving him a card because I knew that if I couldn't keep my promise to him, I'd die. But one day at the office, he worked in the same building as I did, I just walked up to him, handed him the card, and walked away without saying anything. Quitting cold turkey was the hardest thing I've ever done. There must have been 1,000 times when I thought I had to have a smoke. But whenever that happened, I just picture how all of the people on my list, especially this one guy, would think less of me if I couldn't stick to my guns. And that's all it took. I've never taken another puff. You know, the interesting thing is the guy turned out to be a real schmuck. I can't figure out what I saw in him back then, but at the time, without knowing it, he helped me get through the toughest part of the toughest thing I've ever had to do. I don't even like him anymore. Still, I do feel grateful in a way because I think he saved my life. The effort extra. Yet another reason that written commitments are so effective is that they require more work than verbal ones. And the evidence is clear that the more effort that goes into a commitment, the greater is its ability to influence the attitudes of the person who made it. We can find that evidence quite close to home or as far away as the back regions of the primitive world. For example, there is a tribe in southern Africa, the Thonga, that requires each of its boys to go through an elaborate initiation ceremony before he can be counted a man of the tribe. As with many other primitive peoples, a Thonga boy endures a great deal before he is admitted to adult membership in the group. Anthropologists Whiting, Cluckcone, and Anthony have described this 3-month ordeal in brief but vivid terms. When a boy is somewhere between 10 and 16 years of age, he is sent by his parents to circumcision school, which is held every 4 or 5 years. Here, in company with his age mates, he undergoes severe hazing by the adult males of the society. The initiation begins when each boy runs the gauntlet between 2 rows of men who beat him with clubs. At the end of this experience, he is stripped of his clothes and his hair is cut. He is next met by a man covered with lion manes, and is seated upon a stone, facing this lion man. Someone then strikes him from behind, and when he turns his head to see who has struck him, his foreskin is seized, and in 2 movements cut off by the lion man. Afterward he is secluded for 3 months in the Yard of Mysteries, where he can be seen only by the initiated. During the course of his initiation, the boy undergoes 6 major trials: beatings, exposure to cold, thirst, eating of unsavory foods, punishment, and the threat of death. On the slightest pretext, he may be beaten by one of the newly initiated men, who was assigned to the task by the older men of the tribe. He sleeps without covering and suffers bitterly from the winter cold. He is forbidden to drink a drop of water during the whole 3 months. Meals are often made nauseating by the half-digested grass from the stomach of an antelope, which is poured over his food. If he is caught breaking any important rule governing the ceremony, he is severely punished. For example, in one of these punishments, sticks are placed between the fingers of the offender. Then a strong man closes his hand around that of the novice, practically crushing his fingers. He is frightened into submission by being told that in former times boys who had tried to escape, or who had revealed the secrets to women or to the uninitiated, were hanged and their bodies burned to ashes. On the face of it, these rites seem extraordinary and bizarre. Yet at the same time, they can be seen to be remarkably similar in principle and even in detail to the common initiation ceremonies of school fraternities. During the traditional Hell Week held yearly on college campuses, fraternity pledges must persevere through a variety of activities designed by the older members to test the limits of physical exertion, psychological strain, and social embarrassment. At the week's end, the boys who have persisted through the ordeal are accepted for full group membership. Mostly their tribulations have left them no more than greatly tired and a bit shaky, although sometimes the negative effects are more serious. What is interesting is how closely the particular features of Hell Week tasks match those of the tribal initiation rites. Recall that anthropologists identified 6 major trials to be endured by a Thonga initiate during his stay in the Yard of Mysteries. A scan of newspaper reports shows that each trial also has its place in the hazing rituals of Greek letter societies. Beatings. 14-year-old Michael Calligris spent 3 weeks in a Long Island hospital recovering from internal injuries suffered during a Hell Night initiation ceremony of his high school fraternity, Omega Gamma Delta. He had been administered the atomic bomb by his prospective brothers, who told him to hold his hands over his head and keep them there while they gathered around to slam fists into his stomach and back simultaneously and repeatedly. Exposure to cold. On a winter night, Frederick Bronner, a California junior college student, was taken 3,000 feet up and at 10 miles into the hills of a national forest by his prospective fraternity brothers. Left to find his way home wearing only a thin sweatshirt and slacks, Fat Freddy, as he was called, shivered in a frigid wind until he tumbled down a steep ravine, fracturing bones and hurting his head. Prevented by his injuries from going on, he huddled there against the cold until he died of exposure. Thirst. 2 Ohio State University freshmen found themselves in the dungeon of their prospective fraternity house after breaking the rule requiring all pledges to crawl into the dining area prior to Hell Week meals. Once locked in the house storage closet, they were given only salty foods to eat for nearly 2 days. Nothing was provided for drinking purposes except a pair of plastic cups in which they could catch their own urine. Eating of unsavory foods. At Kappa Sigma House, on the campus of the University of Southern California, the eyes of 11 pledges bulged when they saw the sickening task before them. 11 quarter-pound slabs of raw liver lay on a tray. Cut thick and soaked in oil, each was to be swallowed whole, one to a boy. Gagging and choking repeatedly, young Richard Swanson failed 3 times to down his piece. Determined to succeed, he finally got the oil-soaked meat into his throat where it lodged and, despite all efforts to remove it, killed him. Punishment. In Wisconsin, a pledge who forgot one section of a ritual incantation to be memorized by all initiates was punished for his error. He was required to keep his feet under the rear legs of a folding chair while the heaviest of his fraternity brothers sat down and drank a beer. Although the pledge did not cry out during the punishment, a bone in each of his feet was broken. Threats of death. A pledge at Zeta Beta Tau fraternity was taken to a beach area of New Jersey and told to dig his own grave. Seconds after he complied with orders to lie flat in the finished hole, the sides collapsed, suffocating him before his prospective fraternity brothers could dig him out. There is another striking similarity between the initiation rites of tribal and fraternal societies. They simply will not die. Resisting all attempts to eliminate or suppress them, such hazing practices have been phenomenally resilient. Authorities, in the form of colonial governments or university administrations, have tried threats, social pressures, legal actions, banishments, bribes, and bans to persuade the groups to remove the hazards and humiliations from their initiation ceremonies. None has been successful. Oh, there may be a change while the authority is watching closely, but this is usually more apparent than real, the harsher trials occurring under more secret circumstances, until the pressure is off and they can surface again. On some college campuses, officials have tried to eliminate dangerous hazing practices by substituting a help week of civic service or by taking direct control of the initiation rituals. When such attempts are not slyly circumvented by fraternities, they are met with outright physical resistance. For example, in the aftermath of Richard Swanson's choking death at USC, the university president issued new rules requiring that all pledging activities be reviewed by school authorities before going into effect, and that adult advisors be present during initiation ceremonies. According to one national magazine, the new code set off a riot so violent that city police and fire departments were afraid to enter campus. Resigning themselves to the inevitable, other college representatives have given up on the possibility of abolishing the degradations of Hell Week. If hazing is a universal human activity, and every bit of evidence points to this conclusion, you most likely won't be able to ban it effectively. Refuse to allow it openly, and it will go underground. You can't ban sex, and you can't prohibit alcohol, and you probably can't eliminate hazing. What is it about hazing practices that make them so precious to these societies? What could make the groups want to evade, undermine, or contest any effort to ban the degrading and perilous features of their initiation rites? Some have argued that the groups themselves are composed of psychological or social miscreants whose twisted needs demand that others be harmed and humiliated. But the evidence does not support such a view. Studies done on the personality traits of fraternity members, for instance, show them to be, if anything, slightly healthier than other college students in their psychological adjustment. Similarly, fraternities are known for their willingness to engage in beneficial community projects for the general social good. What they are not willing to do, however, is substitute these projects for their initiation ceremonies. One survey at the University of Washington found that of the fraternity chapters examined, most had a type of Help Week tradition, but that this community service was in addition to Hell Week. In only one case was such service directly related to initiation procedures. The picture that emerges of the perpetrators of hazing practices is of normal individuals who tend to be psychologically stable and socially concerned, but who became aberrantly harsh as a group at only one time, immediately before the admission of new members to the society. The evidence, then, points to the ceremony as the culprit. There must be something about its rigors that is vital to the group. There must be some function to its harshness that the group will fight relentlessly to maintain. What? My own view is that the answer appeared in 1959 in the results of a study little known outside of social psychology. A pair of young researchers, Elliot Aronson and Judson Mills, decided to test their observation that persons who go through a great deal of trouble or pain to attain something tend to value it more highly than persons who attain the same thing with a minimum of effort. The real stroke of inspiration came in their choice of the initiation ceremony as the best place to examine this possibility. They found that college women who had to endure a severely embarrassing initiation ceremony in order to gain access to a sex discussion group convinced themselves that their new group and its discussions were extremely valuable, even though Aronson and Mills had previously rehearsed the other group members to be as worthless and uninteresting as possible. Different co-eds who went through a much milder initiation ceremony or went through no initiation at all were decidedly less positive about the worthless new group they had joined. Additional research showed the same results when co-eds were required to endure pain rather than embarrassment to get into a group. The more electric shock a woman received as part of the initiation ceremony, the more she later persuaded herself that her new group and its activities were interesting, intelligent, and desirable. Now the harassments, the exertions, even the beatings of initiation rituals begin to make sense. The Thonga tribesman watching with tears in his eyes his 10-year-old son tremble through a night on the cold ground of the Yard of Mysteries. The college sophomore punctuating his hell night paddling of his fraternity little brother with bursts of nervous laughter. These are not acts of sadism. They are acts of group survival. They function, oddly enough, to spur future society members to find the group more attractive and worthwhile. As long as it is the case that people like and believe in what they have struggled to get, these groups will continue to arrange effortful and troublesome initiation rites. The loyalty and dedication of those who emerge will increase to a great degree the chances of group cohesiveness and survival. Indeed, one study of 54 tribal cultures found that those with the most dramatic and stringent initiation ceremonies were those with the greatest group solidarity. Given Aronson and Mills's demonstration that the severity of initiation ceremony significantly heightens the newcomer's commitment to the group, it is hardly surprising that groups will oppose all attempts to eliminate this crucial link to their future strength. Military groups and organizations are by no means exempt from these same processes. The agonies of boot camp initiations to the armed services are legendary. The novelist William Styron, a former Marine, catalogues his own experiences in language we could easily apply to the Thongas, or for that matter, to the Kappas or Betas or Alphas. The remorseless, close-order drill hour after hour in the burning sun, the mental and physical abuse, the humiliations, the frequent sadism at the hands of drill sergeants, all the claustrophobic and terrifying insults to the spirit which can make an outpost like Quantico or Paris Island one of the closest things in the free world to a concentration camp. But in his commentary, Styron does more than recount the misery of this training nightmare. He recognizes its intended outcome. There is no ex-Marine of my acquaintance, regardless of what direction he may have taken spiritually or politically after those callow gung-ho days, who does not view the training as a crucible out of which he emerged, in some way, more resilient, simply braver and better for the wear. But why should we believe William Styron, the writer in such matters? After all, for professional storytellers, the line between truth and fiction is often blurred. Indeed, why should we believe him when he alleges that the infernal character of his military training was not only successful, it was specifically intended to create desired levels of pride and camaraderie among those who endured and survived it? At least one reason to accept his assessment comes from unfictionalized reality. The case of West Point cadet John Edwards, who was expelled from the U.S. Military Academy in 1988 on charges involving the authorized hazing that all first-year cadets experience at the hands of upperclassmen to ensure that the newcomers can withstand the rigors of West Point training. It was not that Mr. Edwards, who ranked academically near the top of his 1,100-member class, had been unable to bear up under the ritual when he was subjected to it, nor was he expelled because he had been aberrantly cruel in his treatment of the younger cadets. His offense was that he would not expose the newcomers to what he felt was absurd and dehumanizing treatment. Once again, then, it appears that for groups concerned about creating a lasting sense of solidarity and distinction, the hardship of demanding initiation activities provides a valuable advantage that they will not easily surrender, either to aspiring members who are unwilling to take the harshness or to give it out. The inner choice. Examination of such diverse activities as the indoctrination practices of the Chinese Communists and the initiation rituals of college fraternities has provided some valuable information about commitment. It appears that commitments are most effective in changing a person's self-image and future behavior when they are active, public, and effortful. But there is another property of effective commitment that is more important than the other three combined. To understand what it is, we first need to solve a pair of puzzles in the actions of communist interrogators and fraternity brothers. The first puzzle comes from the refusal of fraternity chapters to allow public service activities to be part of their initiation ceremonies. Recall that one survey showed that community projects, though frequent, were nearly always separated from the membership induction program. But why? If an effortful commitment is what fraternities are after in their initiation rites, surely they could structure enough distasteful and strenuous civic activities for their pledges. There is plenty of exertion and unpleasantness to be had in the world of old age home repairs, mental health center yard work, and hospital bedpan duty. Besides, community-spirited endeavors of this sort would do much to improve the highly unfavorable public and media image of Fraternity Hell Week rites. A survey showed that for every positive newspaper story concerning Hell Week, there were 5 negative stories. If only for public relations reasons, then fraternities should want to incorporate community service efforts into their initiation practices. But they don't. To examine the second puzzle, we need to return to the Chinese prison camps of Korea and the regular political essay contests held for American captives. The Chinese wanted as many Americans as possible to enter these contests so that, in the process, they might write things favorable to the communist view. If, however, the idea was to attract large numbers of entrants, why were the prizes so small? A few extra cigarettes or a little fresh fruit were often all that a contest winner could expect. In the setting, even these prizes were valuable. But still, there were much larger rewards: warm clothing, special mail privileges, increased freedom of movement in camp, that the Chinese could have used to increase the number of essay writers, yet they specifically chose to employ the smaller rather than the larger, more motivating rewards. Although the settings are quite different, the surveyed fraternities refused to allow civic activities into their initiation ceremonies for the same reason that the Chinese withheld large prizes in favor of less powerful inducements. They wanted the men to own what they had done. No excuses, no ways out were allowed. A man who suffered through an arduous hazing could not be given the chance to believe he did so for charitable purposes. A prisoner who salted his political essay with a few anti-American comments could not be permitted to shrug it off as motivated by a big reward. No, the fraternity chapters and Chinese communists were playing for keeps. It was not enough to wring commitments out of their men. Those men had to be made to take inner responsibility for their actions. Given the Chinese Communist government's affinity for the political essay contest as a commitment device, it should come as no surprise that a wave of such contests appeared in the aftermath of the 1989 massacre in Tiananmen Square, where pro-democracy protesters were gunned down by government soldiers. In Beijing alone, 9 state-run newspapers and television stations sponsored essay competitions on the quelling of the counter-revolutionary rebellion. Still acting in accord with its long-standing and insightful de-emphasis of rewards for public commitments, the Beijing government left the contest prizes unspecified. Social scientists have determined that we accept inner responsibility for a behavior when we think we have chosen to perform it in the absence of strong outside pressures. A large reward is one such external pressure. It may get us to perform a certain action, but it won't get us to accept inner responsibility for the act. Consequently, we won't feel committed to it. The same is true of a strong threat. It may motivate immediate compliance, but it is unlikely to produce long-term commitment. All this has important implications for rearing children. It suggests that we should never heavily bribe or threaten our children to do the things we want them truly to believe in. Such pressures will probably produce temporary compliance with our wishes. However, if we want more than just that, if we want the children to believe in the correctness of what they have done, If we want them to continue to perform the desired behavior when we are not present to apply those outside pressures, then we must somehow arrange for them to accept inner responsibility for the actions we want them to take. An experiment by Jonathan Friedman gives us some hints about what to do and what not to do in this regard. Friedman wanted to see if he could prevent 2nd to 4th grade boys from playing with a fascinating toy just because he had said that it was wrong to do so some 6 weeks earlier. Anyone familiar with 7 to 9-year-old boys must realize the enormity of the task. But Friedman had a plan. If he could first get the boys to convince themselves that it was wrong to play with a forbidden toy, perhaps that belief would keep them from playing with it thereafter. The difficult thing was making the boys believe that it was wrong to amuse themselves with a toy, an extremely expensive battery-controlled robot. Friedman knew it would be easy enough to have a boy obey temporarily. All he had to do was threaten the boy with severe consequences should he be caught playing with the toy. As long as he was nearby to deal out stiff punishment, Friedman figured that few boys would risk operating the robot. He was right. After showing a boy an array of 5 toys and warning him, "It is wrong to play with the robot. If you play with the robot, I'll be very angry and we'll have to do something about it," Friedman left the room for a few minutes. During that time, the boy was observed secretly through a one-way mirror. Friedman tried this threat procedure on 22 different boys, and 21 of them never touched the robot while he was gone. So a strong threat was successful while the boys thought they might get caught and punished. But Friedman had already guessed that. He was really interested in the effectiveness of the threat in guiding the boys' behavior later on, when he was no longer around. To find out what would happen then, he sent a young woman back to the boys' school about 6 weeks after he had been there. She took the boys out of the class one at a time to participate in an experiment. Without ever mentioning any connection with Friedman, she escorted each boy back to the room with the 5 toys and gave him a drawing test. While she was scoring the test, she told the boy that he was free to play with any toy in the room. Of course, almost all the boys played with the toy. The interesting result was that of the boys playing with the toy, 77% chose to play with the robot that had been forbidden to them earlier. Friedman's severe threat, which had been so successful 6 weeks before, was almost totally unsuccessful when he was no longer able to back it up with punishment. But Friedman wasn't finished yet. He changed his procedure slightly with a second sample of boys. These boys, too, were initially shown the array of 5 toys by Friedman and warned not to play with the robot while he was briefly out of the room, because it is wrong to play with the robot. But this time Friedman provided no strong threat to frighten a boy into obedience. He simply left the room and observed through the one-way mirror to see if his instruction against playing with the forbidden toy was enough. It was. Just as with the other sample, only one of the 22 boys touched the robot during the short time Friedman was gone. The real difference between the 2 samples of boys came 6 weeks later when they had a chance to play with the toys while Friedman was no longer around. An astonishing thing happened with the boys who had earlier been given no strong threat against playing with the robot. When given the freedom to play with any toy they wished, most avoided the robot, even though it was by far the most attractive of the 5 toys available. The others were a cheap plastic submarine, a child's baseball glove without a ball, an unloaded toy rifle, and a toy tractor. When these boys played with one of the 5 toys, only 33% chose the robot. Something dramatic had happened to both groups of boys. For the first group, it was the severe threat they heard from Friedman to back up his statement that playing with the robot was wrong. It had been quite effective at first when Friedman could catch them should they violate his rule. Later, though, when he was no longer present to observe the boys' behavior, his threat was impotent, and his rule was consequently ignored. It seems clear that the threat had not taught the boys that operating the robot was wrong, only that it was unwise to do so when the possibility of punishment existed. For the other boys, the dramatic event had come from the inside, not the outside. Friedman had instructed them, too, that playing with the robot was wrong, but he had added no threat of punishment should they disobey him. There were two important results. First, Friedman's instruction alone was enough to prevent the boys from operating the robot while he was briefly out of the room. Second, the boys took personal responsibility for their choice to stay away from the robot during that time. They decided that they hadn't played with it because they didn't want to. After all, there were no strong punishments associated with the toy to explain their behavior otherwise. Thus, weeks later, when Friedman was nowhere around, they still ignored the robot because they had been changed inside to believe that they did not want to play with it. Adults facing the child-rearing experience can take a cue from the Friedman study. Suppose a couple wants to impress upon their daughter that lying is wrong. A strong, clear threat, "It's bad to lie, honey, so if I catch you at it, I'll cut your tongue out," might well be effective when the parents are present or when the girl thinks she can be discovered. But it will not achieve the larger goal of convincing her that she does not want to lie because she thinks it's wrong. To do that, a much subtler approach is required. A reason must be given that is just strong enough to get her to be truthful most of the time, but is not so strong that she sees it as the obvious reason for her truthfulness. It's a tricky business because exactly what this barely sufficient reason will be changes from child to child. For one little girl, a simple appeal may be enough. "It's bad to lie, honey, so I hope you won't do it." For another child, it may be necessary to add a somewhat stronger reason. "Because if you do, I'll be disappointed in you." For a third child, a mild form of warning may be required as well, and I'll probably have to do something I don't want to do. Wise parents will know which kind of reason will work on their own children. The important thing is to use a reason that will initially produce the desired behavior and will, at the same time, allow a child to take personal responsibility for that behavior. Thus, the less detectable outside pressure such a reason contains, the better. Selecting just the right reason is not an easy task for parents, but the effort should pay off. It is likely to mean the difference between short-lived compliance and long-term commitment. For a pair of reasons we have already talked about, compliance professionals love commitments that produce inner change. First, that change is not just specific to the situation where it first occurred, it covers a whole range of related situations too. Second, the effects of the change are lasting. So once a man has been induced to take action that shifts his self-image to that of, let's say, a public-spirited citizen, he is likely to be public-spirited in a variety of other circumstances where his compliance may also be desired, and he is likely to continue his public-spirited behavior for as long as his new self-image holds. There is yet another attraction in commitments that lead to inner change. They grow their own legs. There is no need for the compliance professional to undertake a costly and continuing effort to reinforce the change. The pressure for consistency will take care of all that. After our friend comes to view himself as a public-spirited citizen, he will automatically begin to see things differently. He will convince himself that it is the correct way to be. He will begin to pay attention to facts he hadn't noticed before about the value of community service. He will make himself available to hear arguments he hadn't heard before favoring civic action, and he will find such arguments more persuasive than before. In general, because of the need to be consistent within his system of beliefs, he will assure himself that his choice to take public-spirited action was right. What is important about this process of generating additional reasons to justify the commitment is that the reasons are new. Thus, even if the original reason for the civic-minded behavior was taken away, these newly discovered reasons might be enough by themselves to support his perception that he had behaved correctly. The advantage to an unscrupulous compliance professional is tremendous. Because we build new struts to undergird choices we have committed ourselves to, an exploitative individual can offer us an inducement for making such a choice, and after the decision has been made, can remove that inducement, knowing that our decision will probably stand on its own newly created legs. New car dealers frequently try to benefit from this process through a trick they call throwing a low ball. I first encountered the tactic while posing as a sales trainee at a local Chevrolet dealership. After a week of basic instruction, I was allowed to watch the regular salesman perform. One practice that caught my attention right away was the lowball. For certain customers, a very good price is offered on a car, perhaps as much as $400 below competitors' prices. The good deal, however, is not genuine. The dealer never intends it to go through. Its only purpose is to cause a prospect to decide to buy one of the dealership's cars. Once the decision is made, a number of activities develop the customer's sense of personal commitment to the car. A raft of purchase forms are filled out, extensive financing terms are arranged. Sometimes the customer is encouraged to drive the car for a day before signing the contract, so you can get the feel of it and show it around in the neighborhood and at work. During this time, the dealer knows customers automatically develop a range of new reasons to support the choice they have now made. Then something happens. Occasionally, an error in the calculations is discovered. Maybe the salesman forgot to add in the cost of the air conditioner, and if the buyer still requires air conditioning, $400 must be added to the price. To keep from being suspected of gouging by the customer, some dealers let the bank handling the financing find the mistake. At other times, the deal is disallowed at the last moment when the salesman checks with his boss, who cancels it because we'd be losing money. For only another $400 the car can be had, which, in the context of a multi-thousand-dollar deal, doesn't seem too steep since, as the salesman emphasizes, the cost is equal to competitors, and this is the car you chose, right? Another even more insidious form of lowballing occurs when the salesman makes an inflated trade-in offer on the prospect's old car as part of the buy-trade package. The customer recognizes the offer as overly generous and jumps at the deal. Later, before the contract is signed, the used car manager says that the salesman's estimate was $400 too high and reduces the trade-in allowance to its actual Blue Book level. The customer, realizing that the reduced offer is the fair one, accepts it as appropriate and sometimes feels guilty about trying to take advantage of the salesman's high estimate. I once witnessed a woman provide an embarrassed apology to a salesman who had used the last version of lowballing on her. This while she was signing a new car contract, giving him a huge commission. He looked hurt, but managed a forgiving smile. No matter which variety of lowballing is used, the sequence is the same. An advantage is offered that induces a favorable purchase decision. Then, sometime after the decision has been made, but before the bargain is sealed, the original purchase advantage is deftly removed. It seems almost incredible that a customer would buy a car under these circumstances. Yet it works, not on everybody, of course, but it is effective enough to be a staple compliance procedure in many, many car showrooms. Automobile dealers have come to understand the ability of a personal commitment to build its own support system, a support system of new justifications for the commitment. Often these justifications provide so many strong legs for the decision to stand on that when the dealer pulls away only one leg, the original one, there is no collapse. The loss can be shrugged off by the customer who is consoled, even made happy by the array of other good reasons favoring the choice. It never occurs to the buyer that those additional reasons might never have existed had the choice not been made in the first place. The impressive thing about the lowball tactic is its ability to make a person feel pleased with a poor choice. Those who have only poor choices to offer us, then, are especially fond of the technique. We can find them throwing lowballs in business, social, and personal situations. For instance, there's my neighbor Tim, a true lowball aficionado. Recall that he's the one who, by promising to change his ways, got his girlfriend Sarah to cancel her impending marriage to another, and to take him back. Since her decision for Tim, Sarah has become more devoted to him than ever, even though he has not fulfilled his promises. She explains this by saying that she has allowed herself to see all sorts of positive qualities in Tim she had never recognized before. I know full well that Sarah is a lowball victim. Just as sure as I had watched buyers fall for the give-it-and-take-it-away-later strategy in the car showroom, I watched her fall for the same trick with Tim. For his part, Tim remains the guy he has always been. But because the new attractions Sarah has discovered, or created in him, are quite real for her, she now seems satisfied with the same arrangement that was unacceptable before her enormous commitment. The decision to choose Tim, poor as it may have been objectively, has grown its own supports and appears to have made Sarah genuinely happy. I have never mentioned to Sarah what I know about lowballing. The reason for my silence is not that I think her better off in the dark on the issue. As a general guiding principle, more information is always better than less information. It's just that if I said a word, I am confident she would hate me for it. Depending on the motives of the person wishing to use them, any of the compliance techniques discussed in this audiobook can be employed for good or for ill. It should not be surprising, then, that the lowball tactic can be used for more socially beneficial purposes than selling new cars or reestablishing relationships with former lovers. One research project done in Iowa, for example, shows how the lowball procedure can influence homeowners to conserve energy. The project, headed by Dr. Michael Palak, began at the start of the Iowa winter when residents who heated their homes with natural gas were contacted by an interviewer. The interviewer gave them some energy conservation tips and asked them to try to save fuel in the future. Although they all agreed to try, when the researchers examined the utility records of these families after a month and again at winter's end, it was clear that no real savings had occurred. The residents who had promised to make a conservation attempt used just as much natural gas as a random sample of their neighbors who had not been contacted by an interviewer. Just good intentions, coupled with information about saving fuel, then, were not enough to change habits. Even before the project began, Palak and his research team had recognized that something more would be needed to shift long-standing energy patterns. So they tried a slightly different procedure on a comparable sample of Iowa natural gas users. These people, too, were contacted by an interviewer, who provided energy-saving hints and asked them to conserve. But for these families, the interviewer offered something else. Those residents, agreeing to save energy, would have their names publicized in newspaper articles as public-spirited, fuel-conserving citizens. The effect was immediate. 1 month later, when the utility companies checked their meters, the homeowners in this sample had saved an average of 422 cubic feet of natural gas apiece. The chance to have their names in the paper had motivated these residents to substantial conservation efforts for a period of a month. Then the rug was pulled out. The researchers extracted the reason that had initially caused these people to save fuel. Each family that had been promised publicity received a letter saying it would not be possible to publicize their names after all. At the end of the winter, the research team examined the effect that letter had had on the natural gas usage of the families. Did they return to their old wasteful habits when the chance to be in the newspaper was removed? Hardly. For each of the remaining winter months, they actually conserved more fuel than they had during the time they thought they would be publicly celebrated for it. In terms of percentage of energy savings, they had managed a 12.2% first-month gas savings, because they expected to see themselves lauded in the paper. But after the letter arrived informing them to the contrary, they did not return to their previous energy use levels. Instead, they increased their savings to a 15.5% level for the rest of the winter. Although we can never be completely sure of such things, one explanation for their persistent behavior presents itself immediately. These people had been lowballed into a conservation commitment through a promise of newspaper publicity. Once made, that commitment started generating its own support. The homeowners began acquiring new energy habits, began feeling good about their public-spirited efforts, began convincing themselves of the vital need to reduce American dependence on foreign oil, began appreciating the monetary savings in their utility bills, began feeling proud of their capacity for self-denial, and most important, began viewing themselves as conservation-minded. With all these new reasons present to justify the commitment to use less energy, it is no wonder that the commitment remained firm even after the original reason, newspaper publicity, had been kicked away. But strangely enough, when the publicity factor was no longer a possibility, these families did not merely maintain their fuel-saving effort, they heightened it. Any of a number of interpretations could be offered for that still stronger effort, but I have a favorite. In a way, the opportunity to receive newspaper publicity had prevented the homeowners from fully owning their commitment to conservation. Of all the reasons supporting the decision to try to save fuel, it was the only one that had come from the outside. It was the only one preventing the homeowners from thinking that they were conserving gas because they believed in it. So when the letter arrived canceling the publicity agreement, it removed the only impediment to these residents' images of themselves as fully concerned, energy-conscious citizens. This unqualified new self-image then pushed them to even greater heights of conservation. Whether or not such an explanation is correct, a repeat study done by Palek indicates that this hidden benefit of the lowball tactic is no fluke. The experiment was done in summer on Iowans whose homes were cooled by central air conditioning. Those homeowners who were promised newspaper publicity decreased their electricity use by 27.8% during July, as compared to similar homeowners who were not promised any coverage or who were not contacted at all. At the end of July, a letter was sent canceling the publicity promise. Rather than reverting to their old habits, the low-balled residents increased their August energy savings to a stunning 41.6%. Much like Sarah, they appeared to have become committed to a choice through an initial inducement, and were still more dedicated to it after the inducement had been removed. How to say no. Consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. Or at least, so goes a frequently heard quotation attributed to Ralph Waldo Emerson. But what a very odd thing to say. Looking around, it is obvious that, quite contrary to what Emerson seems to have suggested, internal consistency is a hallmark of logic and intellectual strength, while its lack characterizes the intellectually scattered and limited among us. What, then, could a thinker of Emerson's caliber have meant when he assigned the trait of consistency to the small-minded? I was sufficiently intrigued to go back to the original source of his statement, the essay Self-Reliance, where it was clear that the problem lay not in Emerson but in the popular version of what he had said. Actually, he wrote, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds." For some obscure reason, a central distinction had been lost as the years eroded the accurate version of his statement to mean something entirely different and, upon close inspection, entirely silly. That distinction should not be lost on us, however, because it is vital to the only effective defense I know against the weapons of influence embodied in the combined principles of commitment and consistency. Although consistency is generally good, even vital, there is a foolish, rigid variety to be shunned. It is this tendency to be automatically and unthinkingly consistent that Emerson referred to. And it is this tendency that we must be wary of, for it lays us open to the maneuvers of those who want to exploit the mechanical commitment-consistency sequence for profit. But since automatic consistency is so useful in allowing us an economical and appropriate way of behaving most of the time, we can't decide merely to eliminate it from our lives altogether. The results would be disastrous. If, rather than whirring along in accordance with our prior decisions and deeds, we stopped to think through the merits of every new action before performing it, we would never have time to accomplish anything significant. We need even that dangerous, mechanical brand of consistency. The only way out of the dilemma is to know when such consistency is likely to lead to a poor choice. There are certain signals, two separate kinds of signals, in fact, to tip us off. We register each type in a different part of our bodies. The first sort of signal is easy to recognize. It occurs right in the pit of our stomachs, when we realize we are trapped into complying with a request we know we don't want to perform. It has happened to me 100 times. An especially memorable instance, though, took place on a summer evening well before I began to study compliance tactics. I answered my doorbell to find a stunning young woman dressed in shorts and a revealing halter top. I noticed nonetheless that she was carrying a clipboard and was asking me to participate in a survey. Wanting to make a favorable impression, I agreed, and I do admit, stretched the truth in my interview answers so as to present myself in the most positive light. Our conversation went as follows. Stunning young woman. Hello, I'm doing a survey on the entertainment habits of city residents, and I wonder if you could answer a few questions for me. Cialdini. Do come in. Thank you, I'll just sit right here and begin. How many times per week would you say that you go out to dinner? Oh, probably 3, maybe 4 times a week. Whenever I can, really. I love fine restaurants. How nice. And do you usually order wine with your dinner? Only if it's imported. I see. What about movies? Do you go to the movies much? The cinema? I can't get enough of good films. I especially like the sophisticated kind with the words on the bottom of the screen. How about you? Do you like to see films? Yes, I do. But let's get back to the interview. Do you go to many concerts? Definitely. The symphonic stuff mostly, of course. But I do enjoy a quality pop group as well. Writing rapidly. Great, just one more question. What about touring performances by theatrical or ballet companies? Do you see them when they're in town? Ah, the ballet. The movement, the grace, the form, I love it. Mark me down as loving the ballet. See it every chance I get. Fine. Just let me recheck my figures here for a moment, Mr. Cialdini. Actually, it's Dr. Cialdini, but that sounds so formal. Why don't you call me Bob? All right, Bob. From the information you've already given me, I'm pleased to say that you could save up to $1,200 a year by joining Club America. A small membership fee entitles you to discounts on most of the activities you've mentioned. Surely someone as socially vigorous as yourself would want to take advantage of the tremendous savings our company can offer on all the things you've already told me you do. Trapped like a rat. Well, I guess so. I remember quite well feeling my stomach tighten as I stammered my agreement. It was a clear call to my brain. Hey, you're being taken here. But I couldn't see a way out. I had been cornered by my own words. To decline her offer at that point would have meant facing a pair of distasteful alternatives. If I tried to back out by protesting that I was not actually the man about town I had claimed to be during the interview, I would come off a liar. But trying to refuse without that protest would make me come off a fool for not wanting to save $1,200. So I bought the entertainment package, even though I knew I had been set up so that the need to be consistent with what I had already said would snare me. No more, though. I listen to my stomach these days, and I have discovered a way to handle people who try to use the consistency principle on me. I just tell them exactly what they are doing. It works beautifully. Most of the time. They don't understand me. They just become sufficiently confused to want to leave me alone. I think they suspect lunacy in anyone who responds to their requests by explaining what Ralph Waldo Emerson meant in distinguishing between consistency and foolish consistency. Usually, they have already begun edging away by the time I have mentioned hobgoblins of the mind and are gone long before I have described the click-whir character of commitment and consistency. Occasionally, though, they realize that I am onto their game. I always know when that happens. It's as clear as the egg on their faces. They invariably become flustered, bumble through a hasty exit line, and go for the door. This tactic has become the perfect counterattack for me. Whenever my stomach tells me I would be a sucker to comply with a request merely because doing so would be consistent with some prior commitment I was tricked into, I relay that message to the requester. I don't deny the importance of consistency, I just point out the absurdity of foolish consistency. Whether in response the requester shrinks away guiltily or retreats in bewilderment, I am content. I have won. An exploiter has lost. I sometimes think about how it would be if that stunning young woman of years ago were to try to sell me an entertainment club membership now. I have it all worked out. The entire interaction would be the same except for the end. Stunning young woman. Surely someone as socially vigorous as yourself would want to take advantage of the tremendous savings our company can offer on all the things you've already told me you do. Cialdini, with great self-assurance. Quite wrong. You see, I recognize what has gone on here. I know that your story about doing a survey was just a pretext for getting people to tell you how often they go out, and that under those circumstances, there is a natural tendency to exaggerate. I also realize that your bosses selected you for this job because of your physical attractiveness and told you to wear clothes showing a lot of your resilient body tissue because a pretty scantily clad woman is likely to get men to brag about what swingers they are in order to impress her. So, I'm not interested in your entertainment club because of what Emerson said about foolish consistency and hobgoblins of the mind. Staring blankly. Huh? Look, what I told you during your fake survey doesn't matter. I refuse to allow myself to be locked into a mechanical sequence of commitment and consistency when I know it's wrong-headed. No click-whirr for me. Huh? Okay, let me put it this way. 1, it would be stupid of me to spend money on something I don't want. 2, I have it on excellent authority, direct from my stomach, that I don't want your entertainment plan. 3, therefore, if you still believe that I will buy it, you probably also still believe in the tooth fairy. Surely someone as intelligent as yourself would be able to understand that. Trapped like a stunning young rat. Well, I guess so. Stomachs are not especially perceptive or subtle organs. Only when it is obvious that we are about to be conned are they likely to register and transmit that message. At other times, when it is not clear that we are being taken, our stomachs may never catch on. Under those circumstances, we have to look elsewhere for a clue. The situation of my neighbor Sarah provides a good illustration. She made an important commitment to Tim by canceling her prior marriage plans. That commitment has grown its own supports, so that even though the original reasons for the commitment are gone, she remains in harmony with it. She has convinced herself with newly formed reasons that she did the right thing, so she stays with Tim. It is not difficult to see why there would be no tightening in Sarah's stomach as a result. Stomachs tell us when we are doing something we think is wrong for us. Sarah thinks no such thing. To her mind, she has chosen correctly and is behaving consistently with that choice. Yet, unless I badly missed my guess, there is a part of Sarah that recognizes her choice as a mistake and her current living arrangement as a brand of foolish consistency. Where exactly that part of Sarah is located, we can't be sure. But our language does give it a name, heart of hearts. It is by definition the one place where we cannot fool ourselves. It is the place where none of our justifications, none of our rationalizations penetrate. Sarah has the truth there, although right now she can't hear its signal clearly through the noise and static of the new support apparatus she has erected. If Sarah has erred in her choice of Tim, how long could she go without clearly recognizing it, without having a massive heart of hearts attack? There is no telling. One thing is certain, however, as time passes, the various alternatives to Tim are disappearing. She had better determine soon whether she is making a mistake. Easier said than done, of course. She must answer an extremely intricate question. Knowing what I now know, if I could go back in time, would I make the same choice? The problem lies in the knowing what I now know part of the question. Just what does she now know, accurately, about Tim? How much of what she thinks of him is the result of a desperate attempt to justify the commitment she made? She claims that since her decision to take him back, he cares for her more, is trying hard to stop his excessive drinking, has learned to make a wonderful omelet, etc. Having tasted a couple of his omelets, I have my doubts. The important issue, though, is whether she believes these things, not just intellectually. We can play such mind games on ourselves, but in her heart of hearts. There may be a little device Sarah can use to find out how much of her current satisfaction with Tim is real, and how much is foolish consistency. Accumulating psychological evidence indicates that we experience our feelings towards something a split second before we can intellectualize about it. My suspicion is that the message sent by the heart of hearts is a pure, basic feeling. Therefore, if we train ourselves to be attentive, we should register it ever so slightly before our cognitive apparatus engages. According to this approach, were Sarah to ask herself the crucial, "Would I make the same choice again?" question, she would be well advised to look for and trust the first flash of feeling she experienced in response. It would likely be the signal from her heart of hearts, slipping through undistorted just before the means by which she could kid herself flooded in. I began using the same device myself whenever I even suspect I might be acting in a foolishly consistent manner. One time, for instance, I had stopped at the self-service pump of a filling station advertising a price per gallon a couple of cents below the rate of other stations in the area. But with pump nozzle in hand, I noticed that the price listed on the pump was 2 cents higher than the display sign price. When I mentioned the difference to a passing attendant, who I later learned was the owner, he mumbled unconvincingly that the rates had changed a few days ago, but there hadn't been time to correct the display. I tried to decide what to do. Some reasons for staying came to mind. I really do need gasoline badly. This pump is available, and I am in sort of a hurry. I think I remember that my car runs better on this brand of gas. I needed to determine whether those reasons were genuine or mere justifications for my decision to stop there. So I asked myself the crucial question. Knowing what I know about the real price of this gasoline, if I could go back in time, would I make the same choice again? Concentrating on the first burst of impression I sensed, the answer was clear and unqualified. I would have driven right past. I wouldn't even have slowed down. I knew then, without the price advantage, those other reasons would not have brought me there. They hadn't created the decision had created them. That settled, there was another decision to be faced, though. Since I was already there, holding the hose, wouldn't it be better to use it than to suffer the inconvenience of going elsewhere to pay the same price? Fortunately, the station attendant owner came over and helped me make up my mind. He asked why I wasn't pumping any gas. I told him I didn't like the price discrepancy, and he said with a snarl, "Listen, nobody's going to tell me how to run my business. If you think I'm cheating you, just put that hose down right now and get off my property as fast as you can do it, bud." Already certain he was a cheat, I was happy to act consistently with my belief and his wishes. I dropped the hose on the spot and drove over it on my way to the closest exit. Sometimes consistency can be a marvelously rewarding thing. Reader's report from a woman living in Portland, Oregon. I was walking through downtown Portland on my way to a lunch appointment when a young, attractive man stopped me with a friendly smile and a powerful line. "Excuse me, I'm involved in a contest, and I need a good-looking woman like yourself to help me win." I was truly skeptical, since I know there are many more attractive women than myself running around. However, I was caught off guard and was curious to find out what he wanted. He explained that he would receive points for a contest by getting total strangers to give him a kiss. Now, I consider myself a fairly level-headed person who shouldn't have believed his line, but he was quite persistent. And since I was almost late for my lunch appointment, I thought, what the heck, I'll give the guy a kiss and get out of here. So I did something totally against my common sense and pecked this total stranger on the cheek in the middle of downtown Portland. I thought that would be the end of it, but I soon learned that it was just the beginning. Much to my distress, he followed the kiss with the line, "You are a great kisser, but the real contest I'm involved in is to sell magazine subscriptions. You must be an active person. Would any of these magazines interest you?" At this point, I should have slugged the guy and walked away, but somehow, because I had complied with his initial request, I felt a need to be consistent, and I complied with his second request. Yes, much to my own disbelief, I actually subscribed to Ski Magazine, which I occasionally enjoy reading but had no intention of subscribing to, gave him a $5 initial subscription fee, and left as quickly as possible, feeling quite frustrated with what I had just done and not understanding why I had done it. Although it still pains me to think about it, In reflecting on the incident after reading your book, I've now figured out what happened. The reason this tactic worked so effectively is because once small commitments have been made, in this case giving a kiss, people tend to add justifications to support the commitment and then are willing to commit themselves further. In this situation, I justified complying with the second request because it was consistent with my initial action. If I had only listened to my stomach signs, I could have saved myself a lot of humiliation. By extracting a kiss, the salesman exploited the consistency principle in two ways. First, by the time he asked for her aid in the magazine contest, his prospect had already gone on record with that kiss as agreeing to help him win a contest. Second, it seems only natural, i.e. congruent, that if a woman feels positively enough toward a man to kiss him, she should feel positively toward helping him out. Chapter 4. Social Proof. Truths are us. Where all think alike, no one thinks very much. Walter Lippmann. I don't know anyone who likes canned laughter. In fact, when I surveyed the people who came into my office one day, several students, 2 telephone repairmen, a number of university professors, and the janitor, the reaction was invariably critical. Television, with its incessant system of laugh tracks and technically augmented mirth, received the most heat. The people I questioned hated canned laughter. They called it stupid, phony, and obvious. Although my sample was small, I would bet that it closely reflects the negative feelings of most of the American public toward laugh tracks. Why, then, is canned laughter so popular with television executives? They have won their exalted positions and splendid salaries by knowing how to give the public what it wants. Yet they religiously employ the laugh tracks that their audiences find distasteful, and they do so over the objections of many of their most talented artists. It is not uncommon for acclaimed directors, writers, or actors to demand the elimination of canned responses from the television projects they undertake. These demands are only sometimes successful, and when they are, it is not without a battle. What could it be about canned laughter that is so attractive to television executives? Why would these shrewd and tested businessmen champion a practice that their potential watchers find disagreeable and their most creative talents find personally insulting? The answer is at once simple and intriguing. They know what the research says. Experiments have found that the use of canned merriment causes an audience to laugh longer and more often when humorous material is presented and to rate the material as funnier. In addition, some evidence indicates that canned laughter is most effective for poor jokes. In the light of these data, the actions of television executives make perfect sense. The introduction of laugh tracks into their comic programming will increase the humorous and appreciative responses of an audience, even, and especially, when the material is of poor quality. Is it any surprise, then, that television, glutted as it is with artless situation comedy attempts, should be saturated with canned laughter? Those executives know precisely what they are doing. But with the mystery of the widespread use of laugh tracks solved, we are left with a more perplexing question. Why does canned laughter work on us the way it does? It is no longer the television executives who appear peculiar. They are acting logically and in their own interests. Instead, it is the behavior of the audience, of you and me, that seems strange. Why should we laugh more at comedy material afloat in a sea of mechanically fabricated merriment? And why should we think that comic flotsam funnier? The executives aren't really fooling us. Anyone can recognize dubbed laughter. It is so blatant, so clearly counterfeit, that there could be no confusing it with the real thing. We know full well that the hilarity we hear is irrelevant to the humorous quality of the joke it follows, that it is created not spontaneously by a genuine audience, but artificially by a technician at a control board. Yet, transparent forgery that it is, it works on us. To discover why canned laughter is so effective, we first need to understand the nature of yet another potent weapon of influence, the principle of social proof. It states that one means we use to determine what is correct is to find out what other people think is correct. The principle applies especially to the way we decide what constitutes correct behavior. We view a behavior as more correct in a given situation to the degree that we see others performing it. Whether the question is what to do with an empty popcorn box in a movie theater, how fast to drive on a certain stretch of highway, or how to eat the chicken at a dinner party. The actions of those around us will be important in defining the answer. The tendency to see an action as more appropriate when others are doing it normally works quite well. As a rule, we will make fewer mistakes by acting in accord with social evidence than contrary to it. Usually, when a lot of people are doing something, it is the right thing to do. This feature of the principle of social proof is simultaneously its major strength and its major weakness. Like the other weapons of influence, it provides a convenient shortcut for determining how to behave, but at the same time makes one who uses the shortcut vulnerable to the attacks of profiteers who lie in wait along its path. In the case of canned laughter, the problem comes when we begin responding to social proof in such a mindless and reflexive fashion that we can be fooled by partial or fake evidence. Our folly is not that we use others' laughter to help decide what is humorous and when mirth is appropriate. That is in keeping with the well-founded principle of social proof. The folly is that we do so in response to patently fraudulent laughter. Somehow, one disembodied feature of humor, a sound, works like the essence of humor. The example from Chapter 1 of The Turkey and the Polecat is instructive here. Remember that because the particular cheep-cheep of turkey chicks is normally associated with newborn turkeys, their mothers will display or withhold maternal care solely on the basis of that sound. And remember how, consequently, it was possible to trick a female turkey into mothering a stuffed polecat, as long as the replica played the recorded cheep-cheep of a baby turkey? The simulated chick sound was enough to start the female's mothering tape whirring. The lesson of the turkey and the polecat illustrates uncomfortably well the relationship between the average viewer and the laugh track playing television executive. We have become so accustomed to taking the humorous reactions of others as evidence of what deserves laughter that we, too, can be made to respond to the sound and not to the substance of the real thing. Much as a cheep-cheep noise removed from the reality of a chick can stimulate a female turkey to mother, so can a recorded ha-ha removed from the reality of a genuine audience stimulate us to laugh. The television executives are exploiting our preference for shortcuts, our tendency to react automatically on the basis of partial evidence. They know that their tapes will cue our tapes. Click, whir. Television executives are hardly alone in their use of social evidence for profit. Our tendency to assume that an action is more correct if others are doing it is exploited in a variety of settings. Bartenders often salt their tip jars with a few dollar bills at the beginning of the evening to simulate tips left by prior customers, and thereby to give the impression that tipping with folding money is proper barroom behavior. Church ushers sometimes salt collection baskets for the same reason, and with the same positive effect on proceeds. Evangelical preachers are known to seed their audience with ringers, who are rehearsed to come forward at a specified time to give witness and donations. For example, an Arizona State University research team that infiltrated the Billy Graham organization reported on such advanced preparations prior to one of his crusade visits. By the time Graham arrives in town and makes his altar call, an army of 6,000 wait with instructions on when to come forth, at varying intervals to create the impression of a spontaneous mass outpouring. Advertisers love to inform us when a product is the fastest growing or largest selling because they don't have to convince us directly that the product is good. They need only say that many others think so, which seems proof enough. The producers of charity telethons devote inordinate amounts of time to the incessant listing of viewers who have already pledged contributions. The message being communicated to the holdouts is clear. Look at all the people who have decided to give. It must be the correct thing to do. At the height of the disco craze, certain discotheque owners manufactured a brand of visible social proof for their club's quality by creating long waiting lines outside when there was plenty of room inside. Salesmen are taught to spice their pitches with numerous accounts of individuals who have purchased the product. Sales and motivation consultant Cabot Robert captures the principle nicely in his advice to sales trainees. Since 95% of the people are imitators and only 5% initiators, people are persuaded more by the actions of others than by any proof we can offer. Researchers, too, have employed procedures based on the principle of social proof, sometimes with astounding results. One psychologist in particular, Albert Bandura, has led the way in developing such procedures for the elimination of undesirable behavior. Bandura and his colleagues have shown how people suffering from phobias can be rid of these extreme fears in an amazingly simple fashion. For instance, in an early study, nursery school-age children chosen because they were terrified of dogs merely watched a little boy playing happily with a dog for 20 minutes a day. This exhibition produced such marked changes in the reactions of the fearful children that after only 4 days, 67% of them were willing to climb into a playpen with a dog and remain confined there, petting and scratching it while everyone else left the room. Moreover, when the researchers tested the children's fear levels again 1 month later, they found that the improvement had not evaporated during that time. In fact, the children were more willing than ever to interact with dogs. An important practical discovery was made in a second study of children who were exceptionally afraid of dogs. To reduce their fears, it was not necessary to provide live demonstrations of another child playing with a dog. Film clips had the same effect, and the most effective type of clips were those depicting not one, but a variety of other children interacting with their dogs. Apparently, the principle of social proof works best when the proof is provided by the actions of a lot of other people. The powerful influence of filmed examples in changing the behavior of children can be used as therapy for various problems. Some striking evidence is available in the research of psychologist Robert O'Connor on socially withdrawn preschool children. We have all seen children of this sort, terribly shy, standing alone at the fringes of the games and groupings of their peers. O'Connor worried that a long-term pattern of isolation was forming, even at an early age, that would create persistent difficulties in social comfort and adjustment through adulthood. In an attempt to reverse the pattern, O'Connor made a film containing 11 different scenes in a nursery school setting. Each scene began by showing a different solitary child watching some ongoing social activity and then actively joining the activity to everyone's enjoyment. O'Connor selected a group of the most severely withdrawn children from 4 preschools and showed them his film. The impact was impressive. The isolates immediately began to interact with their peers at a level equal to that of the normal children in the schools. Even more astonishing was what O'Connor found when he returned to observe 6 weeks later. While the withdrawn children who had not seen O'Connor's film remained as isolated as ever, those who had viewed it were now leading their schools in amount of social activity. It seems that this 23-minute movie, viewed just once, was enough to reverse a potential pattern of lifelong maladaptive behavior. Such is the potency of the principle of social proof. When it comes to illustrations of the strength of social proof, there is one that is far and away my favorite. Several features account for its appeal. It offers a superb example of the much underused method of participant observation, in which a scientist studies a process by becoming immersed in its natural occurrence. It provides information of interest to such diverse groups as historians, psychologists, and theologians, and most important, it shows how social evidence can be used on us, not by others, but by ourselves, to assure us that what we prefer to be true will seem to be true. The story is an old one, requiring an examination of ancient data, for the past is dotted with millennial religious movements. Various sects and cults have prophesied that on one or another particular date there would arrive a period of redemption and great happiness for those who believed in the group's teachings. In each instance, it has been predicted that the beginning of the time of salvation would be marked by an important and undeniable event, usually the cataclysmic end of the world. Of course, these predictions have invariably proved false. To the acute dismay of the members of such groups, the end has never appeared as scheduled. But immediately following the obvious failure of the prophecy, history records an enigmatic pattern. Rather than disbanding in disillusion, the cultists often become strengthened in their convictions. Risking the ridicule of the populace, they take to the streets, publicly asserting their dogma and seeking converts with a fervor that is intensified, not diminished, by the clear disconfirmation of a central belief. So it was with the Montanists of 2nd century Turkey, with the Anabaptists of 16th century Holland, with the Sabbataists of 17th century Izmir, with the Millerites of 19th century America. And, thought a trio of interested social scientists, so it might be with the doomsday cult based in modern-day Chicago. The scientists, Leon Festinger, Henry Rieken, and Stanley Schachter, who were then colleagues at the University of Minnesota, heard about the Chicago group and felt it worthy of close study. Their decision to investigate by joining the group incognito as new believers, and by placing additional paid observers among its ranks, resulted in a remarkably rich first-hand account of the goings-on before and after the day of predicted catastrophe. The cult of believers was small, never numbering more than 30 members. Its leaders were a middle-aged man and woman, whom the researchers renamed, for purposes of publication, Dr. Thomas Armstrong and Mrs. Marion Keach. Dr. Armstrong, a physician on the staff of a college student health service, had a long-held interest in mysticism, the occult, and flying saucers. As such, he served as a respected authority on these subjects for the group. Mrs. Keach, though, was the center of attention and activity. Earlier in the year, she had begun to receive messages from spiritual beings, whom she called the Guardians, located on other planets. It was these messages flowing through Marion Keach's hand via the device of automatic writing that were to form the bulk of the cult's religious belief system. The teachings of the Guardians were loosely linked to traditional Christian thought. No wonder that one of the Guardians, Sananda, eventually revealed himself as the current embodiment of Jesus. The transmissions from the Guardians, always the subjects of much discussion and interpretation among the group, gained new significance when they began to foretell a great impending disaster, a flood that would begin in the Western Hemisphere and eventually engulf the world. Although the cultists were understandably alarmed at first, further messages assured them that they and all those who believed in the lessons sent through Mrs. Keach would survive. Before the calamity, spacemen were to arrive and carry off the believers in flying saucers to a place of safety, presumably on another planet. Very little detail was provided about the rescue except that the believers were to make themselves ready for pickup by rehearsing certain passwords to be exchanged. "I left my hat at home." "What is your question?" "I am my own porter." And by removing all metal from their clothes, because the wearing or carrying of metal made saucer travel extremely dangerous. As Festinger, Rieken, and Schachter observed the preparations during the weeks prior to the flood date, they noted with special interest two significant aspects of the members' behavior. First, the level of commitment to the cult's belief system was very high. In anticipation of their departure from doomed Earth, irrevocable steps were taken by the group members. Most had incurred the opposition of family and friends to their beliefs, but had persisted nonetheless in their convictions, often when it meant losing the affections of these others. In fact, several of the members were threatened by neighbors or family with legal actions designed to have them declared insane. In Dr. Armstrong's case, a motion was filed by his sister to have his 2 younger children taken away. Many believers quit their jobs or neglected their studies to devote full time to the movement, Some even gave or threw away their personal belongings, expecting them shortly to be of no use. These were people whose certainty that they had the truth allowed them to withstand enormous social, economic, and legal pressures, and whose commitment to their dogma grew as each pressure was resisted. The second significant aspect of the believers' pre-flood actions was a curious form of inaction. For individuals so clearly convinced of the validity of their creed, they did surprisingly little to spread the word. Although they did initially make public the news of the coming disaster, there was no attempt to seek converts, to proselyte actively. They were willing to sound the alarm and to counsel those who voluntarily responded to it, but that was all. The group's distaste for recruitment efforts was evident in various ways, besides the lack of personal persuasion attempts. Secrecy was maintained in many matters. Extra copies of the lessons were burned. Passwords and secret signs were instituted. The contents of certain private tape recordings were not to be discussed with outsiders. So secret were the tapes that even longtime believers were prohibited from taking notes of them. Publicity was avoided. As the day of disaster approached, increasing numbers of newspaper, television, and radio reporters converged on the group's headquarters in the Keach House. For the most part, those people were turned away or ignored. The most frequent answer to their questions was no comment. Although discouraged for a time, the media representatives returned with a vengeance when Dr. Armstrong's religious activities caused him to be fired from his post on the college health service staff. One especially persistent newsman had to be threatened with a lawsuit. A similar siege was repelled on the eve of the flood when a swarm of reporters pushed and pestered the believers for information. Afterward, the researchers summarized the group's pre-flood stance on public exposure and recruitment in respectful tones. Exposed to a tremendous burst of publicity, they had made every attempt to dodge fame. Given dozens of opportunities to proselyte, they had remained evasive and secretive, and behaved with an almost superior indifference. Eventually, when all the reporters and would-be converts had been cleared from the house, the believers began making their final preparations for the arrival of the spaceship scheduled for midnight that night. The scene, as viewed by Festinger, Rieken, and Schachter, must have seemed like absurdist theater. Otherwise ordinary people, housewives, college students, a high school boy, a publisher, an MD, a hardware store clerk and his mother, were participating earnestly in tragic comedy. They took direction from a pair of members who were periodically in touch with the Guardians. Marian Keach's written messages from Sananda were being supplemented that evening by the Bertha, a former beautician through whose tongue the Creator gave instruction. They rehearsed their lines diligently, calling out in chorus the responses to be made before entering the rescue saucer. "I am my own porter. I am my own pointer." They discussed seriously whether the message from a caller identifying himself as Captain Video, a TV space character of the time, was properly interpreted as a prank or a coded communication from their rescuers. And they performed in costume. In keeping with the admonition to carry nothing metallic aboard the saucer, the believers wore clothing that had been cut open to allow the metal pieces to be torn out. The metal eyelets in their shoes had been ripped away. The women were braless or wore brassieres whose metal stays had been removed. The men had yanked the zippers out of their pants, which were supported by lengths of rope in place of belts. The group's fanaticism concerning the removal of all metal was vividly experienced by one of the researchers, who remarked, 25 minutes before midnight, that he had forgotten to extract the zipper from his trousers. As the observers tell it, this knowledge produced a near-panic reaction. He was rushed into the bedroom, where Dr. Armstrong, his hands trembling and his eyes darting to the clock every few seconds, slashed out the zipper with a razor blade and wrenched its clasps free with wire cutters. The hurried operation finished, the researcher was returned to the living room, a slightly less metallic, but, one supposes, much paler man. As the time appointed for their departure grew very close, the believers settled into a lull of soundless anticipation. With trained scientists on site, we are afforded a detailed account of the events that transpired during this momentous period in the life of the group. The last 10 minutes were tense ones for the group in the living room. They had nothing to do but sit and wait, their coats in their laps. In the tense silence, 2 clocks ticked loudly, one about 10 minutes faster than the other. When the faster of the two pointed to 12:05, one of the observers remarked aloud on the fact. A chorus of people replied that midnight had not yet come. Bob Eastman affirmed that the slower clock was correct. He had said it himself only that afternoon. It showed only 4 minutes before midnight. These 4 minutes passed in complete silence, except for a single utterance. When the slower clock on the mantel showed only 1 minute remaining before the guide to the saucer was due, Marion exclaimed in a strained, high-pitched voice, "And not a plan has gone astray." The clock chimed 12, each stroke painfully clear in the expectant hush. The believers sat motionless. One might have expected some visible reaction. Midnight had passed, and nothing had happened. The cataclysm itself was less than 7 hours away, but there was little to see in the reactions of the people in that room. There was no talking, no sound. People sat stock still, their faces seemingly frozen and expressionless. Mark Post was the only person who even moved. He lay down on the sofa and closed his eyes, but did not sleep. Later, when spoken to, he answered monosyllabically, but otherwise lay immobile. The others showed nothing on the surface, although it became clear later that they had been hit hard. Gradually, painfully, an atmosphere of despair and confusion settled over the group. They re-examined the prediction and the accompanying messages. Dr. Armstrong and Mrs. Keach reiterated their faith. The believers mulled over their predicament and discarded explanation after explanation as unsatisfactory. At one point, toward 4 a.m., Mrs. Keach broke down and cried bitterly. She knew, she sobbed, that there were some who were beginning to doubt, but that the group must beam light to those who needed it most, and that the group must hold together. The rest of the believers were losing their composure, too. They were all visibly shaken, and many were close to tears. It was now almost 4:30 a.m., and still no way of handling the disconfirmation had been found. By now, too, most of the group were talking openly about the failure of the escort to come at midnight. The group seemed near dissolution. In the midst of this gathering doubt, as cracks crawled through the believers' confidence, the researchers witnessed a pair of remarkable incidents, one after another. The first occurred at about 4:45 a.m. when Marion Keach's hand suddenly leapt to the task of transcribing through automatic writing the text of a holy message from above. When read aloud, the communication proved to be an elegant explanation for the events of that night. The little group, sitting alone all night long, had spread so much light that God had saved the world from destruction. Although neat and efficient, this explanation was not wholly satisfying by itself. For example, after hearing it, one member simply rose, put on his hat and coat, and left. Something additional was needed to restore the believers to their previous levels of faith. It was at this point that the second notable incident occurred to meet that need. Once again, the words of those who were present offer a vivid description. The atmosphere in the group changed abruptly, and so did their behavior. Within minutes after she had read the message explaining the disconfirmation, Mrs. Keach received another message instructing her to publicize the explanation. She reached for the telephone and began dialing the number of a newspaper. While she was waiting to be connected, someone asked, "Marion, is this the first time you have called the newspaper yourself?" Her reply was immediate. "Oh yes, this is the first time I have ever called them. I have never had anything to tell them before, but now I feel it is urgent." The whole group could have echoed her feelings, for they all felt a sense of urgency. As soon as Marion had finished her call, the other members took turns, telephoning newspapers, wire services, radio stations, and national magazines to spread the explanation of the failure of the flood. In their desire to spread the word quickly and resoundingly, the believers now opened for public attention matters that had been thus far utterly secret. Where only hours earlier they had shunned newspaper reporters and felt that the attention they were getting in the press was painful, they now became avid seekers for publicity. Not only had the long-standing policies concerning secrecy and publicity done an about-face, so too had the group's attitude toward potential converts. Whereas likely recruits who previously visited the house had been mostly ignored, turned away, or treated with casual attention, the day following the disconfirmation saw a different story. All callers were admitted, all questions were answered, attempts were made to proselyte all such visitors. The members' unprecedented willingness to accommodate possible new recruits was perhaps best demonstrated when 9 high school students arrived on the following night to speak with Mrs. Keach. They found her at the telephone, deep in a discussion of flying saucers with a caller whom, it later turned out, she believed to be a spaceman. Eager to continue talking to him, and at the same time anxious to keep her new guests, Marian simply included them in the conversation and for more than an hour chatted alternately with her guests in the living room and the spaceman on the other end of the telephone. So intent was she on proselyting that she seemed unable to let any opportunity go by. To what can we attribute the believers' radical turnabout? In the space of a few hours they went from clannish and taciturn hoarders of the Word to expansive and eager disseminators of it. And what could have possessed them to choose such an ill-timed instant, when the failure of the flood was likely to cause non-believers to view the group and its dogma as laughable? The crucial event occurred sometime during the night of the flood, when it became increasingly clear that the prophecy would not be fulfilled. Oddly, it was not their prior certainty that drove the members to propagate the faith. It was an encroaching sense of uncertainty. It was the dawning realization that if the spaceship and flood predictions were wrong, so might be the entire belief system on which they rested. For those huddled in the Keach living room, that growing possibility must have seemed hideous. The group members had gone too far, given up too much for their beliefs to see them destroyed. The shame, the economic cost, the mockery would be too great to bear. The overarching need of the cultists to cling to those beliefs seeps poignantly from their own words. From a young woman with a 3-year-old child. I have to believe the flood is coming on the 21st because I've spent all my money. I quit my job. I quit computer school. I have to believe. And from Dr. Armstrong to one of the researchers 4 hours after the failure of the saucermen to arrive. I've had to go a long way. I've given up just about everything. I've cut every tie. I've burned every bridge. I've turned my back on the world. I can't afford to doubt. I have to believe, and there isn't any other truth. Imagine the corner in which Dr. Armstrong and his followers found themselves as morning approached. So massive was the commitment to their beliefs that no other truth was tolerable. Yet that set of beliefs had just taken a merciless pounding from physical reality. No saucer had landed. No spaceman had knocked. No flood had come. Nothing had happened as prophesied. Since the only acceptable form of truth had been undercut by physical proof, there was but one way out of the corner for the group. They had to establish another type of proof for the validity of their beliefs. Social proof. This then explains their sudden shift from secretive conspirators to zealous missionaries, and it explains the curious timing of the shift, precisely when a direct disconfirmation of their beliefs had rendered them least convincing to outsiders. It was necessary to risk the scorn and derision of the non-believers because publicity and recruitment efforts provided the only remaining hope. If they could spread the word, if they could inform the uninformed, if they could persuade the skeptics, and if by so doing they could win new converts, their threatened but treasured beliefs would become truer. The principle of social proof says so. The greater the number of people who find any idea correct, the more the idea will be correct. The group's assignment was clear. Since the physical evidence could not be changed, the social evidence had to be. Convince, and ye shall be convinced. Cause of death: uncertainty. All the weapons of influence discussed in this book work better under some conditions than under others. If we are to defend ourselves adequately against any such weapon, it is vital that we know its optimal operating conditions in order to recognize when we are most vulnerable to its influence. In the case of the principle of social proof, we have already had a hint of one time when it works best. Among the Chicago believers, it was a sense of shaken confidence that triggered their craving for converts. In general, when we are unsure of ourselves, when the situation is unclear or ambiguous, when uncertainty reigns, we are most likely to look to and accept the actions of others as correct. In the process of examining the reactions of other people to resolve our uncertainty, however, we are likely to overlook a subtle but important fact. Those people are probably examining the social evidence too. Especially in an ambiguous situation, the tendency for everyone to be looking to see what everyone else is doing can lead to a fascinating phenomenon called pluralistic ignorance. A thorough understanding of the pluralistic ignorance phenomenon helps immeasurably to explain a regular occurrence in our country that has been termed both a riddle and a national disgrace: the failure of entire groups of bystanders to aid victims in agonizing need of help. The classic example of such bystander inaction, and the one that has produced the most debate in journalistic, political, and scientific circles, began as an ordinary homicide case in the borough of Queens in New York City. A woman in her late 20s, Catherine Genovese, was killed in a late-night attack on her home street as she returned from work. Murder is never an act to be passed off lightly. But in a city the size and tenor of New York, the Genovese incident warranted no more space than a fraction of a column in the New York Times. Catherine Genovese's story would have died with her on that day in March 1964 if it hadn't been for a mistake. The metropolitan editor of the Times, A.M. Rosenthal, happened to be having lunch with the city police commissioner a week later. Rosenthal asked the commissioner about a different Queens-based homicide, and the commissioner, thinking he was being questioned about the Genovese case, revealed something staggering that had been uncovered by the police investigation. It was something that left everyone who heard it, the commissioner included, aghast and grasping for explanations. Catherine Genovese had not experienced a quick, muffled death. It had been a long, loud, tortured, public event. Her assailant had chased and attacked her in the street 3 times over a period of 35 minutes before his knife finally silenced her cries for help. Incredibly, 38 of her neighbors watched the events of her death unfold from the safety of their apartment windows, without so much as lifting a finger to call the police. Rosenthal, a former Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, knew a story when he heard one. On the day of his lunch with the commissioner, he assigned a reporter to investigate the bystander angle of the Genovese incident. Within a week, the Times published a long page-one article that was to create a swirl of controversy and speculation. The first few paragraphs of that report provide the tone and focus of the burgeoning story. For more than half an hour, 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens in Queens watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens. Twice the sound of their voices and the sudden glow of their bedroom lights interrupted him and frightened him off. Each time he returned, sought her out, and stabbed her again. Not one person telephoned the police during the assault. One witness called after the woman was dead. That was 2 weeks ago today, but Assistant Chief Inspector Frederick M. Lewson, in charge of the borough's detectives and a veteran of 25 years of homicide investigations, is still shocked. He can give a matter-of-fact recitation of many murders, but the Kew Gardens slaying baffles him, not because it is a murder, but because good people failed to call the police. As with Assistant Chief Inspector Lewson, shock and bafflement were the standard reactions of almost everyone who learned the story's details. The shock struck first, leaving the police, the news people, and the reading public stunned. The bafflement followed quickly. How could 38 good people fail to act under those circumstances. No one could understand it. Even the murder witnesses themselves were bewildered. "I don't know," they answered one after another. "I just don't know." A few offered weak reasons for their inaction. For example, 2 or 3 people explained that they were afraid or did not want to get involved. But these reasons do not stand up to close scrutiny. A simple, anonymous call to the police could have saved Catherine Genovese without threatening the witnesses' future safety or free time. No, it wasn't the observers' fear or reluctance to complicate their lives that explained their lack of action. Something else was going on there that even they could not fathom. Confusion, though, does not make for good news copy. So the press, as well as the other media, several papers, TV stations, and magazines were pursuing follow-up stories by now, emphasized the only explanation available at the time. The witnesses, no different from the rest of us, hadn't cared enough to get involved. We were becoming a nation of selfish, insensitive people. The rigors of modern life, especially city life, were hardening us. We were becoming the cold society, unfeeling and indifferent to the plight of our fellow citizens. In support of this interpretation, news stories began appearing regularly in which various kinds of public apathy were detailed. The Times actually appears to have developed an apathy beat for a period following the Genovese revelations. Also supporting such an interpretation were the remarks of a range of armchair social commentators who, as a breed, seem never to admit to bafflement when speaking to the press. They too saw the Genovese case as having large-scale social significance. All used the word apathy, which, it is interesting to note, had been in the headline of the Times front-page story, although they accounted for the apathy differently. One attributed it to the effects of TV violence, another to repressed aggressiveness, but most implicated the depersonalization of urban life, with its megalopolitan societies and its alienation of the individual from the group. Even Rosenthal, the newsman who first broke the story and who ultimately made it the subject of a book, subscribed to the city-caused apathy theory. Nobody can say why the 38 did not lift the phone while Miss Genovese was being attacked, since they cannot say themselves. It can be assumed, however, that their apathy was indeed one of the big city variety. It is almost a matter of psychological survival, if one is surrounded and pressed by millions of people to prevent them from constantly impinging on you, and the only way to do this is to ignore them as often as possible. Indifference to one's neighbor and his troubles is a conditioned reflex in life in New York, as it is in other big cities. As the Genovese story grew, aside from Rosenthal's book, it became the focus of numerous newspaper and magazine pieces, several television news documentaries, and an off-Broadway play. It attracted the professional attention of a pair of New York-based psychology professors, Bibb Latané and John Darley. They examined the reports of the Genovese incident and, on the basis of their knowledge of social psychology, hit on what had seemed the most unlikely explanation of all. It was that 38 witnesses were present. Previous accounts of the story had invariably emphasized that no action was taken, even though 38 individuals had looked on. Latané and Darley suggested that no one had helped precisely because there were so many observers. The psychologists speculated that, for at least 2 reasons, a bystander to an emergency would be unlikely to help when there were a number of other bystanders present. The first reason is fairly straightforward. With several potential helpers around, the personal responsibility of each individual is reduced. Perhaps someone else will give or call for aid. Perhaps someone else already has. So with everyone thinking that someone else will help or has called, no one does. The second reason is the more psychologically intriguing one. It is founded on the principle of social proof and involves the pluralistic ignorance effect. Very often, an emergency is not obviously an emergency. Is the man lying in the alley a heart attack victim or a drunk sleeping one off? Are the sharp sounds from the street gunshots or truck backfires? Is the commotion next door an assault requiring the police or an especially loud marital spat where intervention would be inappropriate and unwelcome? What is going on? In times of such uncertainty, the natural tendency is to look around at the actions of others for clues. We can learn from the way the other witnesses are reacting whether the event is or is not an emergency. What is easy to forget, though, is that everybody else observing the event is likely to be looking for social evidence too. And because we all prefer to appear poised and unflustered among others, we are likely to search for that evidence placidly with brief, camouflaged glances at those around us. Therefore, everyone is likely to see everyone else looking unruffled and failing to act. As a result, and by the principles of social proof, the event will be roundly interpreted as a non-emergency. This, according to Latané and Darley, is the state of pluralistic ignorance, in which each person decides that since nobody is concerned, nothing is wrong. Meanwhile, the danger may be mounting to the point where a single individual, uninfluenced by the seeming calm of others, would react. The fascinating upshot of Latané and Darley's reasoning is that for the emergency victim, the idea of safety in numbers may often be completely wrong. It might be that someone in need of emergency aid would have a better chance of survival if a single bystander rather than a crowd was present. To test this unusual thesis, Darley, Latané, their students, and colleagues performed a systematic and impressive program of research that produced a clear set of findings. Their basic procedure was to stage emergency events that were observed either by a single individual or by a group of people. They then recorded the number of times the emergency victim received help under those circumstances. In their first experiment, a New York college student who appeared to be having an epileptic seizure received help 85% of the time when there was a single bystander present, but only 31% of the time with 5 bystanders present. With almost all the single bystanders helping, it becomes difficult to argue that ours is the cold society where no one cares for suffering others. Obviously, it was something about the presence of other bystanders that reduced helping to shameful levels. Other studies have examined the importance of social proof in causing widespread witness apathy. They have done so by planting within a group of witnesses to a possible emergency people who are rehearsed to act as if no emergency were occurring. For instance, in another New York-based experiment, 75% of lone individuals who observed smoke seeping from under a door reported the leak. However, when similar leaks were observed by 3-person groups, the smoke was reported only 38% of the time. The smallest number of bystanders took action, though, when the 3-person groups included 2 individuals who had been coached to ignore the smoke. Under those conditions, the leaks were reported only 10% of the time. In a similar study conducted in Toronto, single bystanders provided emergency aid 90% of the time, whereas such aid occurred in only 16% of the cases when a bystander was in the presence of 2 other bystanders who remained passive. After more than a decade of such research, social scientists now have a good idea of when a bystander will offer emergency aid. First, and contrary to the view that we have become a society of callous, uncaring people, once witnesses are convinced that an emergency situation exists, aid is very likely. Under these conditions, the numbers of bystanders who either intervene themselves or summon help is quite comforting. For example, in 4 separate experiments done in Florida, accident scenes involving a maintenance man were staged. When it was clear that the man was hurt and required assistance, he was helped 100% of the time in 2 of the experiments. In the other 2 experiments, where helping involved contact with potentially dangerous electrical wires, the victim still received bystander aid in 90% of the instances. In addition, these extremely high levels of assistance occurred whether the witnesses observed the events singly or in groups. The situation becomes very different when, as in many cases, bystanders cannot be sure that the event they are witnessing is an emergency. Then, a victim is much more likely to be helped by a lone bystander than by a group, especially if the people in the group are strangers to one another. It seems that the pluralistic ignorance effect is strongest among strangers. Because we like to look poised and sophisticated in public, and because we are unfamiliar with the reactions of those we do not know, we are unlikely to give off or correctly read expressions of concern when in a grouping of strangers. Therefore, a possible emergency becomes viewed as a non-emergency and the victim suffers. A close look at this set of research findings reveals an enlightening pattern. All the conditions that decrease an emergency victim's chances for bystander aid exist normally and innocently in the city. 1. In contrast to rural areas, cities are more clamorous, distracting, rapidly changing places where it is difficult to be certain of the nature of the events one encounters. 2. Urban environments are more populous by their nature. Consequently, people are more likely to be with others when witnessing a potential emergency situation. 3. City dwellers know a much smaller percentage of fellow residents than do people who live in small towns. Therefore, city dwellers are more likely to find themselves in a group of strangers when observing an emergency. These 3 natural characteristics of urban environments, their confusion, their populousness, and their low levels of acquaintanceship, fit in very well with the factors shown by research to decrease bystander aid. Without ever having to resort to such sinister concepts as urban depersonalization and megalopolitan alienation, then we can explain why so many instances of bystander inaction occurs in our cities. De-victimizing yourself. But explaining the dangers of modern urban life in less ominous terms does not dispel them. And as the world's populations move increasingly to the cities, half of all humanity will be city dwellers within 10 years. There will be a growing need to reduce those dangers. Fortunately, our newfound understanding of the bystander apathy process offers real hope. Armed with this scientific knowledge, an emergency victim can increase enormously the chances of receiving aid from others. The key is the realization that groups of bystanders fail to help because the bystanders are unsure rather than unkind. They don't help because they are unsure of whether an emergency actually exists and whether they are responsible for taking action. When they are sure of their responsibilities for intervening in a clear emergency, people are exceedingly responsive. Once it is understood that the enemy is not some unmanageable societal condition like urban depersonalization, but is, instead, the simple state of uncertainty, it becomes possible for emergency victims to take specific steps to protect themselves by reducing the bystander's uncertainty. Imagine, for example, you are spending a summer afternoon at a music concert in the park. As the concert ends and people begin leaving, you notice a slight numbness in one arm but dismiss it as nothing to be alarmed about. Yet, while moving with the crowd to the distant parking areas, you feel the numbness spreading down to your hand and up one side of your face. Feeling disoriented, you decide to sit against a tree for a moment to rest. Soon, you realize that something is drastically wrong. Sitting down has not helped. In fact, the control and coordination of your muscles has worsened to the point that you are starting to have difficulty moving your mouth and tongue to speak. You try to get up, but can't. A terrifying thought slashes to mind. Oh God, I'm having a stroke. Groups of people are passing by, and most are paying you no attention. The few who notice the odd way you are slumped against the tree or the strange look on your face check the social evidence around them, and, seeing that no one else is reacting with concern, walk on past, convinced that nothing is wrong. Were you to find yourself in such a predicament, what could you do to overcome the odds against receiving help? Because your physical abilities would be deteriorating, time would be crucial. If before you could summon aid you lost your speech or mobility or consciousness, your chances for assistance and for recovery would plunge drastically. It would be essential to try to request help quickly. But what would the most effective form of that request be? Moans, groans, or outcries probably would not do. They might bring you some attention, but they would not provide enough information to assure passers-by that a true emergency existed. If mere outcries are unlikely to produce help from the passing crowd, perhaps you should be more specific. Indeed, you need to do more than try to gain attention. You should call out clearly your need for assistance. You must not allow bystanders to define your situation as a non-emergency. Use the word help to cry out your need for emergency aid. And don't worry about being wrong. Embarrassment is a villain to be crushed here. In the context of a possible stroke, you cannot afford to be worried about the awkwardness of overestimating your problem. The difference in cost is that between a moment of embarrassment and possible death or lifelong paralysis. But even a resounding call for help is not your most effective tactic, although it may reduce bystanders' doubts about whether a real emergency exists. It will not remove several other important uncertainties within each onlooker's mind. What kind of aid is required here? Should I be the one to provide the aid, or should someone more qualified do it? Has someone else already gone to get professional help, or is it my responsibility? While the bystanders stand gawking at you and grappling with these questions, time vital to your survival could be slipping away. Clearly, then, as a victim, you must do more than alert bystanders to your need for emergency assistance. You must also remove their uncertainties about how that assistance should be provided and who should provide it. But what would be the most efficient and reliable way to do so? Based on the research findings we have seen, my advice would be to isolate one individual from the crowd. Stare, speak, and point directly at that person and no one else. You, sir, in the blue jacket, I need help. Call an ambulance. With that one utterance, you should dispel all the uncertainties that might prevent or delay help. With that one statement, you will have put the man in the blue jacket in the role of rescuer. He should now understand that emergency aid is needed. He should understand that he, not someone else, is responsible for providing the aid, and finally, he should understand exactly how to provide it. All the scientific evidence indicates that the result should be quick, effective assistance. In general, then, your best strategy when in need of emergency help is to reduce the uncertainties of those around you concerning your condition and their responsibilities. Be as precise as possible about your need for aid. Do not allow bystanders to come to their own conclusions because, especially in a crowd, the principle of social proof and the consequent pluralistic ignorance effect might well cause them to view your situation as a non-emergency. And request assistance of a single individual from the group of onlookers. Fight the natural tendency to make a general request for help. Pick out one person and assign the task to that individual. Otherwise, it is too easy for everyone in the crowd to assume that someone else should help, will help, or has helped. Of all the techniques in this book designed to produce compliance with a request, this one may be the most important to remember. After all, the failure of your request for emergency aid could have severe personal consequences. Not long ago, I received some first-hand evidence on this point. I was involved in a rather serious automobile collision. Both I and the other driver were plainly hurt. He was slumped unconscious over his steering wheel, while I managed to stagger, bloody, from behind mine. The accident had occurred in the center of an intersection in full view of several individuals stopped in their cars at the traffic light. As I knelt in the road beside my door trying to clear my head, the light changed, and the waiting cars began to roll slowly through the intersection. Their drivers gawked but did not stop. I remember thinking, "Oh no, it's happening just like the research says. They're all passing by." I consider it fortunate that, as a social psychologist, I knew enough about the bystander studies to have that particular thought. By thinking of my predicament in terms of the research findings, I knew exactly what to do. Pulling myself up so I could be seen clearly, I pointed at the driver of one car, "Call the police," to a second and a third driver pointing directly each time, "Pull over, we need help." The responses of these people were instantaneous. They summoned a police car and ambulance immediately. They used their handkerchiefs to blot the blood from my face. They put a jacket under my head. They volunteered to serve as witnesses to the accident. One even offered to ride with me to the hospital. Not only was this help rapid and solicitous, it was infectious. After drivers entering the intersection from the other direction saw cars stopping for me, they stopped and began tending to the other victim. The principle of social proof was working for us now. The trick had been to get the ball rolling in the direction of aid. Once that was accomplished, I was able to relax and let the bystanders' genuine concern and social proof's natural momentum do the rest. Monkey me, monkey do. A bit earlier, we stated that the principle of social proof, like all other weapons of influence, works better under some conditions than under others. We have already explored one of those conditions, uncertainty. Without question, when people are uncertain, they are more likely to use others' actions to decide how they themselves should act. But in addition, there is another important working condition: similarity. The principle of social proof operates most powerfully when we are observing the behavior of people just like us. It is the conduct of such people that gives us the greatest insight into what constitutes correct behavior for ourselves. Therefore, we are more inclined to follow the lead of a similar individual than a dissimilar one. That is why I believe we are seeing an increasing number of average person on the street testimonials on TV these days. Advertisers now know that one successful way to sell a product to ordinary viewers, who compose the largest potential market, is to demonstrate that other ordinary people like and use it. So whether the product is a brand of soft drink or pain reliever or a laundry detergent, we hear volleys of praise from John or Mary Everyperson. More compelling evidence for the importance of similarity in determining whether we will imitate another's behavior comes from scientific research. An especially apt illustration can be found in a study done several years ago by Columbia University psychologists. The researchers placed wallets on the ground in various locations around Midtown Manhattan to observe what would happen when they were found. The wallets all contained $2 in cash, a $26.30 check, and various information providing the name and address of the wallet's owner. In addition to this material, the wallet also contained a letter that made it evident that the wallet had been lost not once, but twice. The letter was written to the wallet's owner from a man who had found it earlier and whose intention was to return it. The finder indicated in his letter that he was happy to help and that the chance to be of service in this way had made him feel good. It was evident to anyone who found one of these wallets that this well-intentioned individual had then lost the wallet himself on the way to the mailbox. The wallet was wrapped in an envelope addressed to the owner. The researchers wanted to know how many people finding such a wallet would follow the lead of the first finder and mail it, intact, to the original owner. Before they dropped the wallets, however, the researchers varied one feature of the letter it contained. Some of the letters were written in standard English by what seemed to be an average American, while the other letters were written in broken English by the first finder, who identified himself as a recently arrived foreigner. In other words, the person who had initially found the wallet and had tried to return it was depicted by the letter as being either similar or dissimilar to most Americans. The interesting question was whether the Manhattanites who found the wallet and letter would be more influenced to mail the wallet if the first man who had tried to do so was similar to them. The answer was plain. Only 33% of the wallets were returned when the first finder was seen as dissimilar, but fully 70% were returned when he was thought to be a similar other. These results suggest an important qualification of the principle of social proof. We will use the actions of others to decide on proper behavior for ourselves, especially when we view those others as similar to ourselves. This tendency applies not only to adults but to children as well. Health researchers have found, for example, that a school-based anti-smoking program had lasting effects only when it used same-age peer leaders as teachers. Another study found that children who saw a film depicting a child's positive visit to the dentist lowered their own dental anxieties principally when they were the same age as the child in the film. I wish I had known about this second study when, a few years before it was published, I was trying to reduce a different kind of anxiety in my son, Chris. I live in Arizona, where backyard swimming pools abound. One regrettable consequence is that every year several young children drown after falling into an unattended pool. I was determined, therefore, to teach Chris how to swim at an early age. The problem was not that he was afraid of the water. He loved it. But he would not get into the pool without wearing his inflatable plastic inner tube, no matter how I tried to coax, talk, or shame him out of it. After getting nowhere for 2 months, I hired some help, a graduate student of mine, a big, strapping former lifeguard who had once worked as a swimming instructor. He failed as totally as I had. He couldn't persuade Chris to attempt even a stroke outside of his plastic ring. Around this time, Chris was attending a day camp that provided a number of activities to its members, including use of a large pool, which he scrupulously avoided. One day, shortly after the graduate student fiasco, I went to get Chris from camp a bit early and, with mouth agape, watched him run down the diving board and jump into the middle of the deepest part of the pool. Panicking, I began pulling off my shoes to jump in to his rescue when I saw him bob to the surface and paddle safely to the side of the pool, where I dashed, shoes in hand, to meet him. "Chris, you can swim," I said excitedly. "You can swim." "Yes," he responded casually. "I learned how today." "This is terrific! This is just terrific!" I burbled, gesturing expansively to convey my enthusiasm. "But how come you didn't need your plastic ring today?" Looking somewhat embarrassed because his father seemed to be raving while inexplicably soaking his socks in a small puddle and waving his shoes around, Chris explained, "Well, I'm 3 years old, and Tommy is 3 years old, and Tommy can swim without a ring, so that means I can too." I could have kicked myself. Of course, it would be to little Tommy, not to a 6'2" graduate student, that Chris would look for the most relevant information about what he could or should do. Had I been more thoughtful about solving Chris's swimming problem, I could have employed Tommy's good example earlier and perhaps have saved myself a couple of frustrating months. I could have simply noted at the day camp that Tommy was a swimmer and then arranged with his parents for the boys to spend a weekend afternoon swimming in our pool. My guess is that Chris's plastic ring would have been abandoned by the end of the day. Any factor that can spur 70% of New Yorkers to return a wallet, or can reduce the likelihood that kids will take up smoking or will fear a dentist visit, must be considered impressive. Yet research findings of this sort offer just a hint of the immense impact that the conduct of similar others has on human behavior. Other, more powerful examples exist. To my mind, the most telling illustration of this impact starts with a seemingly nonsensical statistic. After a suicide has made front-page news, airplanes, private planes, corporate jets, airliners, begin falling out of the sky at an alarming rate. For example, it has been shown that immediately following certain kinds of highly publicized suicide stories, the number of people who die in commercial airline crashes increases by 1,000%. Even more alarming, the increase is not limited to airplane deaths. The number of automobile fatalities shoots up as well. What could possibly be responsible? One explanation suggests itself immediately. The same social conditions that cause some people to commit suicide cause others to die accidentally. For instance, certain individuals, the suicide-prone, may react to stressful societal events, economic downturns, rising crime rates, international tensions, by ending it all. But others will react differently to these same events. They might become angry or impatient, or nervous, or distracted. To the degree that such people operate or service the cars and planes of our society, the vehicles will be less safe, and consequently, we will see a sharp increase in the number of automobile and air fatalities. According to this social conditions interpretation, then, some of the same societal factors that cause intentional deaths also cause accidental ones, and that is why we find so strong a connection between suicide stories and fatal crashes. But another fascinating statistic indicates that this is not the correct explanation. Fatal crashes increase dramatically only in those regions where the suicide has been highly publicized. Other places, existing under similar social conditions, whose newspapers have not publicized the story, have shown no comparable jump in such fatalities. Furthermore, within those areas where newspaper space has been allotted, the wider the publicity given the suicide, the greater has been the rise in subsequent crashes. Thus, it is not some set of common societal events that stimulates suicides on the one hand and fatal accidents on the other. Instead, it is the publicized suicide story itself that produces the car and plane wrecks. To explain the strong association between suicide story publicity and subsequent crashes, a bereavement account has been suggested. Because it has been argued front-page suicides often involve well-known and respected public figures. Perhaps their highly publicized deaths throw many people into states of shocked sadness. Stunned and preoccupied, these individuals become careless around cars and planes. The consequence is the sharp increase in deadly accidents involving such vehicles that we see after front-page suicide stories. Although the bereavement theory can account for the connection between the degree of publicity given a story and subsequent crash fatalities, the more people who learn of the suicide, the larger number of bereaved and careless individuals there will be. It cannot explain yet another startling fact. Newspaper stories reporting on suicide victims who died alone produce an increase in the frequency of single fatality wrecks only, whereas stories reporting on suicide plus murder incidents produce an increase in multiple fatality wrecks only. Simple bereavement could not cause such a pattern. The influence of suicide stories on car and plane crashes, then, is fantastically specific. Stories of pure suicides, in which only one person dies, generate wrecks in which only one person dies. Stories of suicide-murder combinations, in which there are multiple deaths, generate wrecks in which there are multiple deaths. If neither social conditions nor bereavement account for this bewildering array of facts, what can? There is a sociologist at the University of California at San Diego who thinks he has found the answer. His name is David Phillips, and he points a convincing finger at something called the Werther effect. The story of the Werther effect is both chilling and intriguing. More than 2 centuries ago, the great man of German literature, Johann von Goethe, published a novel entitled Die Leiden des jungen Werthers, The Sorrows of Young Werther. The book in which the hero, named Werther, commits suicide had a remarkable impact. Not only did it provide Goethe with immediate fame, but it also sparked a wave of emulative suicides across Europe. So powerful was this effect that authorities in several countries banned the novel. Professor Phillips' own work has traced the Werther effect to modern times. His research has demonstrated that immediately following a front-page suicide story, the suicide rate increases dramatically in those geographical areas where the story has been highly publicized. It is Phillips' argument that certain troubled people who read of another's self-inflicted death kill themselves in imitation. In a morbid illustration of the principle of social proof, these people decide how they should act on the basis of how some other troubled person has acted. Phillips got his evidence for the modern-day Werther effect by examining the suicide statistics in the United States between 1947 and 1968. He found that within 2 months after every front-page suicide story, an average of 58 more people than usual killed themselves. In a sense, each suicide story killed 58 people who otherwise would have gone on living. Phillips also found that this tendency for suicides to beget suicides occurred principally in those parts of the country where the first suicide was highly publicized, and that the wider the publicity given the first suicide, the greater the number of later suicides. If the facts surrounding the Werther effect seem to you suspiciously like those surrounding the influence of suicide stories on air and traffic fatalities, the similarities have not been lost on Professor Phillips either. In fact, he contends that all the excess deaths following a front-page suicide incident can be explained as the same thing: copycat suicides. Upon learning of another suicide, an uncomfortably large number of people decide that suicide is an appropriate action for themselves as well. Some of these individuals then proceed to commit the act in a straightforward, no-bones-about-it fashion, causing the suicide rate to jump. Others, however, are less direct. For any of several reasons, to protect their reputations, to spare their families the shame and hurt, to allow their dependents to collect on insurance policies, they do not want to appear to have killed themselves. They would rather seem to have died accidentally. So, purposefully but furtively, they cause the wreck of a car or a plane they are operating or are simply riding in. This could be accomplished in a variety of all too familiar-sounding ways. A commercial airline pilot could dip the nose of the aircraft at a crucial point of takeoff, or could inexplicably land on an already occupied runway against instructions from the control tower. The driver of a car could suddenly swerve into a tree or into oncoming traffic. A passenger in an automobile or corporate jet could incapacitate the operator, causing a deadly crash. The pilot of a private plane could, despite all radio warnings, plow into another aircraft. Thus, the alarming climb in crash fatalities we find following front-page suicides is, according to Dr. Phillips, most likely due to the Werther effect secretly applied. I consider this insight brilliant. First, it explains all the data beautifully. If these wrecks really are hidden instances of imitative suicide, it makes sense that we should see an increase in the wrecks after suicide stories appear, and it makes sense that the greatest rise in wrecks should occur after the suicide stories that have been most widely publicized and have consequently reached the most people. And it makes sense that the number of crashes should jump appreciably only in those geographical areas where the suicide stories were publicized. And it even makes sense that single-victim suicides should lead only to single-victim crashes, whereas multiple-victim suicide incidents should lead only to multiple-victim crashes. Imitation is the key. But there is a second valuable feature of Phillips' insight. Not only does it allow us to explain the existing facts, it also allows us to predict new facts that had never been uncovered before. For example, if the abnormally frequent crashes following publicized suicides are genuinely due to imitative rather than accidental actions, they should be more deadly as a result. That is, people trying to kill themselves will likely arrange with a foot on the accelerator instead of the brake, with the nose of the plane down instead of up, for the impact to be as lethal as possible. The consequence should be quick and sure death. When Phillips examined the records to check on this prediction, he found that the average number of people killed in a fatal crash of a commercial airliner is more than 3 times greater if the crash happened 1 week after a front-page suicide story than if it happened 1 week before. A similar phenomenon can be found in traffic statistics, where there is evidence for the deadly efficiency of post-suicide story auto crashes. Victims of fatal car wrecks that follow front-page suicide stories die 4 times more quickly than normal. Programs was followed by an average increase of 35 suicides over what would have been expected in the next week. What's more, televised movies and public service programs on the topic, even those designed to reduce the problem, create an immediate cluster of self-inflicted deaths, with impressionable, imitation-prone teenagers being the most frequent victims. Still another fascinating prediction flows from Phillips' idea. If the increase in wrecks following suicide stories truly represents a set of copycat deaths, then the imitators should be most likely to copy the suicides of people who are similar to them. The principle of social proof states that we use information about how others have behaved to help us determine proper conduct for ourselves. But as the dropped wallet experiment showed, we are most influenced in this fashion by the actions of others like us. Therefore, Phillips reasoned, if the principle of social proof is behind the phenomenon, there should be some clear similarity between the victim of the highly publicized suicide and those who cause subsequent wrecks. Realizing that the clearest test of this possibility would come from the records of automobile crashes involving a single car and a lone driver, Phillips compared the age of the suicide story victim with the ages of the lone drivers killed in single car crashes immediately after the story appeared in print. Once again, the predictions were strikingly accurate. When the newspaper detailed the suicide of a young person, it was young drivers who then piled their cars into trees, poles, and embankments with fatal results. But when the news story concerned an older person's suicide, older drivers died in such crashes. I advise, then, to take special care in our travels at these times. This last statistic is the crusher for me. I am left wholly convinced and simultaneously wholly amazed by it. Evidently, the principle of social proof is so wide-ranging and powerful that its domain extends to the fundamental decision for life or death. Professor Phillips' findings have persuaded me of a distressing tendency for suicide publicity to motivate certain people who are similar to the victim to kill themselves, because they now find the idea of suicide more legitimate. Truly frightening are the data indicating that many innocent people die in the bargain. A glance at the graphs documenting the undeniable increase in traffic and air fatalities following publicized suicides, especially those involving murder, is enough to cause concern for one's own safety. I have been sufficiently affected by these statistics to begin to take note of front-page suicide stories and to change my behavior in the period after their appearance. I try to be especially cautious behind the wheel of my car. I am reluctant to take extended trips requiring a lot of air travel. If I must fly during such a period, I purchase substantially more flight insurance than I normally would. Dr. Phillips has done us a service by demonstrating that the odds for survival when we traveled change measurably for a time following the publication of certain kinds of front-page suicide stories. It would seem only prudent to play those odds. As if the frightening features of Phillips' suicide data weren't enough, his subsequent research brings more cause for alarm. Homicides in this country have a stimulated copycat character after highly publicized acts of violence. Heavyweight champion prize fights that receive coverage on network evening news appear to produce measurable increases in the U.S. homicide rate. This analysis of heavyweight championship fights between 1973 and 1978 is perhaps most compelling in its demonstration of the remarkably specific nature of the imitative aggression that is generated. When such a match was lost by a black fighter, the homicide rate during the following 10 days rose significantly for young black male victims, but not young white males. On the other hand, when a white fighter lost a match, it was young white men, but not young black men who were killed more frequently in the next 10 days. When these results are combined with the parallel findings in Phillips' suicide data, it is clear that widely publicized aggression has the nasty tendency to spread to similar victims, no matter whether the aggression is inflicted on the self or on another. Work like Dr. Phillips's helps us appreciate the awesome influence of the behavior of similar others. Once the enormity of that force is recognized, it becomes possible to understand perhaps the most spectacular act of compliance of our time, the mass suicide at Jonestown, Guyana. Certain crucial features of that event deserve review. The People's Temple was a cult-like organization that began in San Francisco and drew its recruits from the poor of that city. In 1977, the Reverend Jim Jones, who was the group's undisputed political, social, and spiritual leader, moved the bulk of the membership with him to a jungle settlement in Guyana, South America. There, the People's Temple existed in relative obscurity until November 18, 1978, when 4 men of a fact-finding party led by Congressman Leo J. Ryan were murdered as they tried to leave Jonestown by plane. Convinced that he would be arrested and implicated in the killings and that the demise of the People's Temple would result, Jones sought to control the end of the temple in his own way. He gathered the entire community around him and issued a call for each person's death in a unified act of self-destruction. The first response was that of a young woman who calmly approached the now famous vat of strawberry-flavored poison, administered 1 dose to her baby, 1 to herself, and then sat down in a field, where she and her child died in convulsions within 4 minutes. Others followed steadily in turn. Although a handful of Jonestowners escaped rather than comply and a few others are reported to have resisted, the survivors claim that the great majority of the 910 people who died did so in an orderly, willful fashion. News of the event shocked us. The broadcast media and the papers provided a barrage of reports, updates, and analyses. For days, our conversations were full of the topic. How many have they found dead now? A guy who escaped says they were drinking the poison like they were hypnotized or something. What were they doing down in South America anyway? It's so hard to believe. What caused it? Yes, what caused it, the critical question. How are we to account for this most astounding of compliant acts? Various explanations have been offered. Some have focused on the charisma of Jim Jones, a man whose style allowed him to be loved like a savior, trusted like a father, and treated like an emperor. Other explanations have pointed to the kind of people who were attracted to the People's Temple. They were mostly poor and uneducated individuals who were willing to give up their freedoms of thought and action for the safety of a place where all decisions would be made for them. Still other explanations have emphasized the quasi-religious nature of the People's Temple, in which unquestioned faith in the cult's leader was assigned highest priority. No doubt each of these features of Jonestown has merit in explaining what happened there. But I do not find them sufficient. After all, the world abounds with cults populated by dependent people who were led by a charismatic figure. What's more, there has never been a shortage of this combination of circumstances in the past. Yet virtually nowhere do we find evidence of an event even approximating the Jonestown incident among such groups. There must be something else that was critical. One especially revealing question gives us a clue. If the community had remained in San Francisco, would Reverend Jim Jones's suicide command have been obeyed? A highly speculative question, to be sure, but the expert most familiar with the People's Temple has no doubt about the answer. Dr. Louis Jolyon West, chairman of psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences at UCLA, and director of its neuropsychiatric unit, is an authority on cults who had observed the People's Temple for 8 years prior to the Jonestown deaths. When interviewed in the immediate aftermath, he made what strikes me as an inordinately instructive statement. This wouldn't have happened in California, but they lived in total alienation from the rest of the world, in a jungle situation in a hostile country. Although lost in the welter of commentary following the tragedy, Dr. West's observation, together with what we know about the principle of social proof, seems to me quite important to a satisfactory understanding of the compliant suicides. To my mind, the single act in the history of the People's Temple that most contributed to the members' mindless compliance that day occurred a year earlier with the relocation of the temple to a jungled country of unfamiliar customs and strange people. If we are to believe the stories of Jim Jones's malevolent genius, he realized fully the massive psychological impact such a move would have on his followers. All at once, they found themselves in a place they knew nothing about. South America and the rainforests of Guyana especially were unlike anything they had experienced in San Francisco. The country, both physical and social, into which they were dropped, must have seemed dreadfully uncertain. Ah, uncertainty, the right-hand man of the principle of social proof. We have already seen that when people are uncertain, they look to the actions of others to guide their own actions. In the alien Guyanese environment, then, temple members were very ready to follow the lead of others. But as we have also seen, it is others of a special kind whose behavior would be most unquestioningly followed, similar others. And therein lies the awful beauty of the Reverend Jim Jones's relocation strategy. In a country like Guyana, there were no similar others for a Jonestown resident but the people of Jonestown itself. What was right for a member of the community was determined to a disproportionate degree by what other community members, influenced heavily by Jones, did and believed. When viewed in this light, the terrible orderliness, the lack of panic, the sense of calm with which these people moved to the vat of poison and to their deaths, seems more comprehensible. They hadn't been hypnotized by Jones. They had been convinced, partly by him, but more important, also by the principle of social proof, that suicide was correct conduct. The uncertainty they surely felt upon first hearing the death command must have caused them to look to those around them for a definition of the appropriate response. It is particularly worth noting that they found 2 impressive pieces of social evidence, each pointing in the same direction. The first was the initial set of their compatriots, who quickly and willingly took the poison drafts. There will always be a few such fanatically obedient individuals in any strong leader-dominated group. Whether in this instance they had been specially instructed beforehand to serve as examples, or whether they were just naturally the most compliant with Jones's wishes, is difficult to know. No matter, the psychological effect of the actions of those individuals must have been potent. If the suicides of similar others in news stories can influence total strangers to kill themselves, imagine how enormously more compelling such an act would be when performed without hesitation by one's neighbors in a place like Jonestown. The second source of social evidence came from the reactions of the crowd itself. Given the conditions, I suspect that what occurred was a large-scale instance of the pluralistic ignorance phenomenon that frequently infects onlookers at emergencies. Each Jonestowner looked to the actions of surrounding individuals to assess the situation, and finding seeming calm because everyone else, too, was surreptitiously assessing rather than reacting, learned that patient turn-taking was the correct behavior. Such misinterpreted but nonetheless convincing social evidence would be expected to result precisely in the ghastly composure of the assemblage that waited in the tropics of Guyana for business-like death. From my own perspective, most attempts to analyze the Jonestown incident have focused too much on the personal qualities of Jim Jones. Although he was without question a man of rare dynamism, the power he wielded strikes me as coming less from his remarkable personal style than from his understanding of fundamental psychological principles. His real genius as a leader was his realization of the limitations of individual leadership. No leader can hope to persuade, regularly and single-handedly, all the members of the group. A forceful leader can reasonably expect, however, to persuade some sizable proportion of group members. Then the raw information that a substantial number of group members has been convinced can, by itself, convince the rest. Thus, the most influential leaders are those who know how to arrange group conditions to allow the principle of social proof to work maximally in their favor. It is in this that Jones appears to have been inspired. His master stroke was the decision to move the People's Temple community from its roots in urban San Francisco to the remoteness of equatorial South America, where the conditions of uncertainty and exclusive similarity would make the principle of social proof operate for him as perhaps nowhere else. There, a settlement of 1,000 people, much too large to be held in persistent sway by the force of one man's personality, could be changed from a following into a herd. As slaughterhouse operators have long known, the mentality of a herd makes it easy to manage. Simply get some members moving in the desired direction, and the others, responding not so much to the lead animal as to those immediately surrounding them, will peacefully and mechanically go along. The powers of the amazing Reverend Jim Jones, then, are probably best understood not in terms of his dramatic personal style, but in his profound knowledge of the art of social jiu-jitsu. How to say no. This chapter began with an account of the relatively harmless practice of laugh tracking and has moved on to stories of murder and suicide, all explained by the principle of social proof. How can we expect to defend ourselves against a weapon of influence that pervades such a vast range of behavior? The difficulty is compounded by the realization that most of the time we don't want to guard against the information that social proof provides. The evidence it offers about how we should act is usually valid and valuable. With it, we can cruise confidently through a myriad of decisions without personally having to investigate the detailed pros and cons of each. In this sense, the principle of social proof equips us with a wonderful kind of automatic pilot device, not unlike that aboard most aircraft. Yet there are occasional but real problems with automatic pilots. These problems appear whenever the flight information locked into the control mechanism is wrong. In these instances, we will be taken off course. Depending on the size of the error, the consequences can be severe. But because the automatic pilot afforded by the principle of social proof is more often an ally than an enemy, we can't be expected to want simply to disconnect it. Thus, we are faced with a classic problem: how to make use of a piece of equipment that simultaneously benefits and imperils our welfare. Fortunately, there is a way out of the dilemma. Because the disadvantages of automatic pilots arise principally when incorrect data have been put into the control system, our best defense against these disadvantages is to recognize when the data are in error. If we can become sensitive to situations where the social proof automatic pilot is working with inaccurate information, we can disengage the mechanism and grasp the controls when we need to. There are two types of situation in which incorrect data cause the principle of social proof to give us poor counsel. The first occurs when the social evidence has been purposely falsified. Invariably, these situations are manufactured by exploiters intent on creating the impression, reality be damned, that a multitude is performing the way the exploiters want us to perform. The canned laughter of TV comedy shows, which we have already discussed, is one variety of faked data of this sort. But there is a great deal more, and much of the fakery is strikingly obvious. For instance, canned responses are not unique to the electronic media, or even to the electronic age. In fact, the heavy-handed exploitation of the principle of social proof can be traced through the history of one of our most venerable art forms, grand opera. This is the phenomenon called clacking, said to have been begun in 1820 by a pair of Paris opera house habitués named Sauton and Porcher. The men were more than opera-goers, though. They were businessmen whose product was applause. Organizing under the title L'Assurance des Succès Dramatiques, they leased themselves and their employees to singers and opera managers who wished to be assured of an appreciative audience response. So effective were they in stimulating genuine audience reaction with their rigged reactions that before long, claques, usually consisting of a leader, chef de claque, and several individual claqueurs, had become an established and persistent tradition throughout the world of opera. As music historian Robert Sabin notes, by 1830 the claque was a full-bloom institution, collecting by day, applauding by night, all in the honest open. But it is altogether probable that neither Sauton nor his ally Porcher had a notion of the extent to which their scheme of paid applause would be adopted and applied wherever opera is sung. As clacking grew and developed, its practitioners offered an array of styles and strengths. In the same way that laugh-track producers can hire individuals who excel in titters, chuckles, or belly laughs, the claques spawned their own specialists, the pleureuses, chosen for their ability to weep on cue, the bisseurs, who called bis repeat and encore in ecstatic tones, and in direct kinship with today's laugh-track performer, the rieur, selected for the infectious quality of his laugh. For our purposes, though, the most instructive parallel to modern forms of canned response is the conspicuous character of the fakery. No special need was seen to disguise or vary the claque, who often sat in the same seats, performance after performance, year after year, led by a chef de claque 2 decades into his position. Even the monetary transactions were not hidden from the public. Indeed, 100 years after the birth of clacking, a reader of the London Musical Times could scan the advertised rates of the Italian claqueurs. Whether in the world of Rigoletto or Gilligan's Island, then, audiences have been successfully manipulated by those who use social evidence, even when that evidence has been openly falsified. Advertised rates of the Italian claque. For applause on entrance, if a gentleman, 25 lire. For applause on entrance, if a lady, 15 lire. Ordinary applause during performance, each 10 lire. Insistent applause during performance, each 15 lire. Still more insistent applause, 17 lire. For interruptions with bene or bravo, 5 lire. For a bis at any cost, 50 lire.